The mind of man is capable of anything, because everything is in it, all the past as well as all the future. This line is the running theme of Joseph Conrad's 1899 novella, Heart of Darkness, one of the most brutal, well-known, and adapted stories of the era for good reason. To understand the set piece of the story, you need to understand some history. From 1885 to 1908, the country that is now the Democratic Republic of Congo was known as the Congo Free State. In the late 1800s, several European countries were building colonial empires through the continent of Africa. Most of these countries were seen as legal extensions of the country that was colonizing them. So therefore, the colonies had to abide by the rules of the nation, or at least on paper. The Congo Free State was different in that regard, as the King of Belgium, Leopold II, personally bought the nation of Congo. So it wasn't owned by Belgium per se, it was just owned by the King of Belgium. King Leopold II justified this by explaining it as a manner to help the people of Africa. He was going to bring industry, success, and technology to the people of the Congo, and that is not at all what happened. The Congo Free State was home to some of the most overlooked atrocities in humanity's history. Technicalities of punishment and law allowed for horrific things to be done in the name of wealth. And several people were made quite wealthy from this endeavor, as the Congo River in particular was used to trade everything from rubber to elephant ivory. All the while, even by the most conservative estimates, millions of people died. The Congo Free State would come to an end in 1908, but while it was still active, a writer named Joseph Conrad worked on a steamboat on the Congo River. Conrad was a very educated man. English was his third language, but nevertheless, he is among the most famous of English writers. And his most famous story by far is Heart of Darkness, a story that is based on his experiences while working on the Congo in 1890. It was originally published as a 3-part serial in Blackwoods magazine in 1899, eventually being compiled into its own novella. In the novella, while making up characters and events, he used the real backdrop of the things he witnessed while on the Congo. And this story was one of the first things to make Europeans change their mind regarding colonialism in Africa, as the book depicts several of the atrocities Conrad witnessed while working there. The story uses this real historical backdrop to tell a fictional one. The story of a man named Marlow who is sent by a company operating on the Congo River, or just the river as it's called in the story, to find an agent of the company who's gone off the grid and seemingly gone mad. All the while, our protagonist witnesses the madness of the world around him as he seeks out one who seemingly stepped off the face of the earth, a man named Mr. Kurtz. One of the most famous antagonists in all of literature, and one I'm excited to talk about today. So hello everybody, today we're going to be talking about Heart of Darkness. I love this story and I can't wait to talk about it. Compared to some novels I've covered, Heart of Darkness is a comparatively short read. So as always, don't take my word for it, check out the story for yourself. I'll have a digital and physical link to it in the description below. As with any story, it's better to experience it for yourself before you let me spoil all the fun parts, or in this case, tragic parts. Which I want to clarify, this story covers some really brutal themes. Several things relating to slavery, imperialism, and genocide. Several of the language and events is fitting of the time. So I think this story is worth your time if you're okay with those themes. Viewer discretion advised. I'm also going to talk about some of the adaptations of Heart of Darkness at the end of this video, along with a very special announcement that I am so excited to share. Also, since you all were asking, the Redacted collection is available for a few more weeks. So you can get the WIU hat and jacket, the calligraphy set, or the Manhunt t-shirt for a limited time, so get in while you can, and if you choose to support, it means a lot, and thank you. So if all that sounds interesting to you, then stick around after the ad as we talk about a story as disturbing as it is thought-provoking with Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. With the holiday travel, it can be hard to stay healthy, especially when eating healthy means breaking the bank or your enjoyment. But thankfully, you can have inexpensive, healthy, and delicious meals thanks to today's sponsor, Factor. That's because Factor delivers fresh, never frozen, chef-crafted, and dietitian-approved meals straight to your door. Meals that are ready to heat and eat in 2 minutes and require virtually no prep or cleanup. And if there wasn't enough to love about Factor before, they keep getting better. That's because now they have over 100 options every week. Not only meals, but things like salads, breakfasts, shakes, and more. Recently, they've added double the seafood and protein options as compared to last year. And you can tailor the meals however you want, from vegetarian to gluten-free. You can even swap out the protein option if you'd rather have beef than pork. And unlike most quick options, Factor cares about what you put in your body. That's why they've banned over 175 ingredients, from artificial sweeteners to seed oils. It's hard to find something that tastes good while letting you feel good about your decisions. When I was losing weight, Factor was a huge help. Before them, I was so paranoid about calories that a lot of the time I would just skip a meal, which I can attest is a really bad idea right after an exercise. But with Factor, I knew I could eat something quick and easy that wouldn't break my progress, or my spirit. I've loved Factor, and I'm sure you will too, because now's a perfect time to hop on board. That's because right now, if you head to factor75.com or click the link below and use code WendigoonFB50, you'll get 50% off your first Factor box plus free breakfast for a year. That's right, half off your first order and free breakfast for a year. Again, that's code WendigoonFB50 at factor75.com to get in on this incredible offer today. Thank you all for watching the ad. Thank you to Factor for sponsoring the channel. Their link will be in the description. We are now back to the video. We are going to go ahead and get into it, but as always, thank you for watching. Also, as mentioned earlier, the book never explicitly says this is the Congo or the Congo River, but it's clearly the Congo and the Congo River because it's based on Joseph Conrad's own experience, and from the descriptions, duh. So I'm going to refer to it as the Congo throughout this video, even though it's not called that. Fight me. The novella opens with the perspective of someone aboard a ship. The ship itself is sitting at the front of the Thames River, waiting for the tide to turn so the ship can make its way into London. Our narrator describes to us the group of people aboard the ship. The ship's director, a lawyer, and an accountant, but there's one figure aboard the boat that stands out from the rest. Marlow sat cross-legged right aft, leaning against the mizzen mast. He had sunken cheeks, a yellow complexion, a straight back, an ascetic aspect, and, with his arms dropped, the palms of hands outwards, resembled an idol. Notably, Marlow's the only one who receives a name, which is fitting considering he's the focal point of our story. As the sun sets on the ocean, the narrator begins to think of all of the great men who have traveled the same passageway that they are now. He thinks of Sir Francis Drake. He thinks of Captain Franklin of the Northwest Passage expedition, which, I am far too attached to. The narrator thinks of them as knights, people who have traveled for some greater purpose of humanity. The narrator is thinking of the goodness of England. He refers to London as the biggest and greatest town on earth. But this train of thought is cut off when Marlow says, and this also has been one of the dark places of the earth. Marlow goes on to speak of what England must have been like before it was colonized. He imagines what it must have been like for the Romans to arrive at this undiscovered place. He imagines what it would be like to come to an undiscovered land full of savagery, not knowing that it would one day be something great, something of fortune. Marlow goes on to say that, of course, we now are better than the Romans, and draws a distinction between what he views as conquest then and what they are doing now. Mind, none of us would feel exactly like this. What saves us is efficiency, the devotion to efficiency. But these chaps were not much account, really. They were no colonist. Their administration was merely a squeeze, nothing more, I suspect. They were conquerors, and for that you want only brute force. Nothing to boast of when you have it, since your strength is just an accident arising from the weakness of others. They grabbed what they could get for the sake of what was to be got. It was just robbery with violence, aggravated murder on a great scale, and men going at it blind, as is very proper for those who tackle a darkness. The conquest of the earth, which mostly means the taking it away from those who have a different complexion or slightly flatter noses than ourselves, is not a pretty thing when you look into it too much. What redeems it is the idea only. An idea at the back of it. Not a sentimental pretense, but an idea, and an unselfish belief in the idea. Something you can set up and bow down before and offer a sacrifice to. What's interesting is Marlow's lines here compared with some of the things he'll say later in the story. He gives a pretty damning view of conquest, referring to it as aggravated murder, violence for the sake of it. At first, it seems to condemn the idea of empires that take from others, but it's all contextualized by the beginning and end of that paragraph. What saves us is efficiency. What's different is our idea. Not a sentimental idea, not saying that we are great because we are great, but saying we are great because we're doing something great. This is going to be Marlow's headspace through a lot of events of the story, or at least the headspace he tries to stay in. And also, yes, even though we have a narrator on this boat listening to Marlow, 99% of the book is Marlow's account. So our story is an unnamed narrator writing the account of Marlow, who is the narrator of his own story that our narrator is writing down. It's a narration within a narration. You could think of it as a second-person perspective story. Well, second person would be you. So if a book was addressing you, the reader, the whole time, that would be second person. But this is one first-person narrator addressing another first person. So if you add those up, that's two. Now, as mentioned in the introduction, this story takes place around 1890. And at that time, many of the maps and regions of Africa and South America were unknown. So Marlow tells us that when he was a young boy, he was fascinated with these uncharted regions of the world, something that coincides with the author Joseph Conrad's story. He himself was also interested with the unmapped corners of the world, and it's one of the things that pushed him towards working at sea. While Marlow says as he got older, things began to get names. It was no longer unknown rivers or lands, they were all named and documented. But at least with Africa, his interest never went away. A land so far removed from England that so many riches were coming out of kept his interest. Well, one year Marlow decided he wanted to be on a steamboat traveling up the Congo, and by using his aunt to get a good word for him, and as it turns out, Marlow's aunt knows the wife of someone in the administration of a certain trading company. So Marlow's aunt writes to her and he gets a job. We're never told the company's name, but from what we see in the book, it's a Belgian ivory trading company. Ivory, or elephant tusk, is and was an extremely expensive material. Possession of ivory was a sort of status symbol. It was on jewelry, knife handles, billiard balls, and even piano keys. But as mentioned, ivory comes from elephant tusks, and also walrus tusks, but there's not a lot of those in Africa. And the procurement of ivory is brutal. Entire species of elephants were pushed to extinction or near extinction. It's estimated that even now, 20 to 30,000 elephants are killed every year for their tusks, and millions have been killed in the last several decades alone. The only reason we know that is because we started keeping track of things like that. Imagine how bad it was when there were no regulations about it and everyone was paying top dollar for it. The juxtaposition between the brutality of the obtainment and the wealth and bravado that it gives off makes the ivory trade a pretty good analogy for a lot of Conrad's ideas in this story. But of course, at this time, Marlow doesn't care about any of that. He wants to go to Africa. Marlow says he got the job because one of the company's previous captains had been killed by the natives. Marlow elaborates on this by saying, "It was only months and months afterwards, when I made the attempt to recover what was left of the body, that I heard the original quarrel arose from a misunderstanding about some hens. Yes, 2 black hens. Elvan, that was the fellow's name, a Dane, thought himself wrong somehow in the bargain, so he went ashore and started to hammer the chief of the village with a stick." Oh, it didn't surprise me in the least to hear this, and at the same time, to be told that Elvan was the gentlest, quietest creature that ever walked on 2 legs. No doubt he was, but he had been a couple years already out there, engaged in the noble cause, and he probably felt the need at last of asserting his self-respect in some way. So Marlow's describing a previous captain that was killed over 2 chickens, and in describing what he goes on to say was Elvan walking up to the tribe and beating one of them with a stick. Marlow says that he gets it. It makes sense that Elvan would want to do this after a couple of years. Early on, it's a hint of what happens to people who are out here too long, or as Marlow would have us believe, what the jungle does to them. Ultimately, over the course of this argument, Elvan was killed with a spear, and Marlow goes on to say, "Afterwards, nobody seemed to trouble much about Elvan's remains, till I got out and stepped into his shoes. I couldn't let it rest though, but when an opportunity offered at last to meet my predecessor, the grass growing through his ribs was tall enough to hide his bones. They were all there. The supernatural being had not been touched after he fell, and the village was deserted. The huts gaped black, rotting, all askew with the fallen enclosures. A calamity had come to it, sure enough. The people had vanished. Mad terror had scattered them, men, women, and children, through the bush, and they had never returned. What became of the hens, I don't know either. I should think the cause of progress got to them anyhow. However, through this glorious affair, I got my appointment, before I had fairly begun to hope for it. Here the narrative is also giving us an early idea of what happens to people who mess with the order of things. The people you would hold responsible are gone, and the captain's bones are covered in grass. But of course, all of that would come later. For now, Marlow was just excited he got the job. Marlow goes to the company, and the whole affair is very quick. He walks into this large meeting room. The old man in charge is very happy to get him quickly signed on and out the door. And in 45 seconds, Marlow goes from the waiting room to now back out in the waiting room, signing confidentiality agreements. I began to feel slightly uneasy. You know I am not used to such ceremonies, and there was something ominous in the atmosphere. It was just as though I had been led into some conspiracy. I don't know, something not quite right, and I was glad to get out. In the outer room, the two women knitted black wool feverishly. People were arriving, and the younger one was walking back and forth introducing them. The old one sat on her chair. Her flat cloth slippers were propped up on a foot warmer, and a cat reposed on her lap. She wore a starched white affair on her head, had a wart on one cheek, and silver-rimmed spectacles hung on the tip of her nose. She glanced at me above the glasses. The swift and indifferent placidity of the look troubled me. Two youths with foolish and cheery countenances were being piloted over, and she threw at them the same quick glance of unconcerned wisdom. She seemed to know all about them and about me too. An eerie feeling came over me. She seemed uncanny and fateful. Often far away there, I thought of these two, guarding the door of darkness, knitting black wool as for a warm pal, one introducing continuously to the unknown, the other scrutinizing the cheery and foolish faces with unconcerned old eyes. Ave, old knitter of black wool, mortori te salutant. Not many of those she looked at ever saw her again, not half by a long way. Similar to the mention of the captain Marlow would eventually find dead, this is another warning to his position. The company's a little too eager to sign on new people to go to Africa to make their money. And just as Marlow is thinking of this, there's two women knitting black veils. From the description of their black clothing and the white headdress, it sounds like they're at a funeral or in mourning. He describes the look the old lady gives him as a look of wisdom, silently judging him. And as two more people come in to be signed on to the company, she gives them the same look. The phrase Marlow uses there, mortori te salutant, translates to those who are about to die salute you. The phrase gladiators or condemned prisoners would say to the Roman emperor in the Colosseum just before their death. These two women are hallowed figures watching over people who are entering into this profession. They know what's coming, and there's a stoic caution to the old woman's glare. As Marlow says, half of those people she looked at never saw her again, not by a long shot. But regardless, Marlow, like the two young men who enter right after him, are people that just want to see the world, who want to make a lot of money, going somewhere cool. He refers to them as a sort of guard, guarding the door of darkness. Darkness is going to be used as a symbol throughout the story. Even in the opening narration, before Marlow begins to speak, the narrator talks about the dreaded gloom of darkness behind them and the beauty of London. And now these two women stand at the doorway of darkness, turning people away who inevitably go in. From here, Marlow goes to see a doctor, getting a physical before he's sent off. After he's done with the physical, the doctor asks to measure Marlow's head. Marlow says sure, but asks why. The doctor says, I always ask leave, in the interest of science, to measure the crania of those going out there. And when they come back too, I asked. Oh, I never see them, he remarked. And moreover, the changes take place inside, you know. He smiled as if some quiet joke. So you're going out there. Famous. Interesting, too. He gave me a searching glance and made another note. Ever any madness in your family? He asked in a matter-of-fact tone. I felt very annoyed. Is that question in the interest of science, too? It would be, he said, without taking notice of my irritation. Interesting for science to watch the mental changes of individuals on the spot. Are you an alienist? I interrupted. Every doctor should be. A little, answered that original, imperturbably. I have a little theory which you misers who go out there must help me to prove. This is my share in the advantages my country shall reap from the possession of such a magnificent dependency. The mere wealth I leave to others. The doctor seems to think people change when they go down there for too long. He also remarks he never sees people after they come back, which, similar to the ladies in front of the door, ominous. But he wants to see how the minds of men change. This is, as he puts it, the benefits his profession will receive. I mean, there's plenty of industries making a ton of money in the Congo at this point in history, and as the doctor says, the mere wealth I leave to others. But watching the minds of people change is something that healthcare, that medicine will get out of what he refers to as the magnificent dependency, an interesting way to word the Belgian control of the Congo. An idea, as the doctor probably relieves, that the Congo is now reliant on Belgium, thinking the people of the Congo to be some poor creatures who need liberated from savagery at the hands of the mighty Europeans. But in his conversation, the doctor's true motives are exposed. The wealth others will receive and the knowledge he will receive, or his profession. The magnificent dependency idea goes back on what Marlow was talking about earlier, the difference between conquest and this righteous colonialism. The belief that there is an idea or righteousness at the back of this that makes it a mission's work rather than an internment. This idea continues when Marlow goes to see his aunt, the same one that got him the job. He says that his aunt had recommended him a little too much, and now several dignitaries and politicians knew him as a great man who they were lucky to have working for them. But there was another reason his aunt wanted him to have this job. I was also one of the workers, with a capital, something like an emissary of light, something like a lower sort of apostle. There had been a lot of such rot let loose in print and talk just about that time, and that excellent woman, living right in the rush of all that humbug, got carried off her feet. She talked about weaning those ignorant millions from their horrid ways, till, upon my word, she made me quite uncomfortable. See, the reason King Leopold was able to justify this control of the Congo to the other European nations was by framing this as a sort of humanitarian effort. Not, we're going down there to make a bunch of money, but we're going down there to establish industry, to give purpose. By saying, sure, all of those people down there are lesser than us, but with the right industry, we can bring them up to our level. I will also make millions and millions of dollars doing this, but that's not important. However, all of the political propaganda around this time was pushing the king's message. And it seems Marlow's aunt drank the Kool-Aid on this, thinking of Marlow as a lesser apostle, thinking her nephew was going to educate the ignorant millions, as she calls them. Marlow is made uncomfortable by this, not because of her characterization of the Africans, but by her characterization of the company. I ventured to hint that the company was run for profit. "You forget, dear Charlie, that the laborer is worthy of his hire," she said brightly. "It's queer how out of touch with truth women are. They live in a world of their own. There has never been anything like it, never can be. It's too beautiful altogether, and if they were to set it up, it would go to pieces before the first, some confounded fact we men have been living contentedly with ever since the day of creation, would start up and knock the whole thing over." A couple things to note there. So Marlow tells his aunt that he thinks the company is ran for profit, and she says, well, the laborer is worthy of his hire. In other words, well, sure, the company's making money, but they deserve some money for all the good they're doing down there, which the rest of the book is going to be about the good they're doing down there. And also, the random comment about women not understanding things seems kind of out of left field. My first time reading it, I thought it came out of nowhere, and there's a couple other instances similar to this throughout the book. And the whole time I was reading, I was confused until I got to the very last page of the story. Then it made sense why these random comments about women are made. Now, obviously, on first glance, these comments about women not understanding truth seem out of touch. But I believe these random story beats of misogyny, similar to story beats of racism, are purposefully included by Conrad. As again, these are characterizations given to Marlow that will amount to something later. So Marlow begins his trip to the Congo, heading down to the continent of Africa on a French steamer. Once the French steamer lands, he's to travel on land to the company's office and acquire his steamboat. The French boat he's on makes its way down the coast, dropping off at various depots, mail stations. There were several European governments and companies operating in Africa. One thing Marlow comes across is a French man-of-war. This ship is floating off the coast and hurling cannonballs into the tree line. Pop would go one of the 6-inch guns. A small flame would dart and vanish. A little white smoke would disappear. A tiny projectile would give a feeble screech, and nothing happened. Nothing could happen. There was a touch of insanity in the proceeding, a sense of lugubrious drollery in the sight, and it was not dissipated by somebody on board assuring me earnestly there was a camp of natives, he called them enemies, hidden out of sight somewhere. We gave her her letters. I heard the men in the lonely ship were dying of fever at the rate of 3 a day, and went on. Again, another example of Europeans acting strangely within the continent. They're dying of fever, shooting cannonballs into the jungle. Sure that there are enemies out there, but all Marlow can see are trees. Eventually, they make it to the mouth of the Congo River. From here, Marlow gets onto a smaller steamship whose captain is Swedish. Marlow's job begins 200 miles upriver. There, he's going to captain his own ship for the company, but first he has to make it 200 miles in, and for the first 30 miles, this Swede captain will take him up. While speaking to the Swedish captain, the captain asks what do men who just come here for money get up to when they make it all the way to the interior. While remarking on this, the captain says, "The other day I took up a man who hanged himself on the road. He was a Swede too." "Hanged himself? Why in God's name?" I cried. Kept on looking out watchfully. Who knows? The sun too much for him. Or the country, perhaps. Eventually, this captain gets Marlow to his first station. Stations were made all up and down the Congo as ports where riverboats could drop off goods or stay for the night. But this station itself isn't much to go on, just a few wooden barracks. As Marlow walks up the hill, it's covered in old machinery, rusted boilers and railway trucks. They're trying to build a railroad through here, but there seems to be more decay than progress. He remarks that currently they're trying to build the railroad over a cliff face. He hears an alarm sound, everyone moves away from the cliff, and they detonate explosives trying to destroy it. But after the explosion, nothing's changed. Marlow also remarks he doesn't think they actually have to destroy the cliff to build the railroad, but that's what they're doing. There's not a lot of sense to the work that's being done. While making his way up to the post, Marlow comes across this. A sight clinking behind me made me turn my head. 6 black men advanced in a file, toiling up the path. They walked erect and slow, balancing small baskets full of earth on their heads, and the clink kept time with their footsteps. Black rags were wound round their loins, and the short ends behind waggled to and fro like tails. I could see every rib. The joints of their limbs were like knots in a rope. Each had an iron collar on his neck, and all were connected together with a chain whose bites swung between them, rhythmically clinking. Another report from the cliff made me think suddenly of that ship of war I had seen firing into a continent. It was the same kind of ominous voice. But these men could by no stretch of imagination be called enemies. They were called criminals, and the outraged law, like the bursting shells, had come to them, an insoluble mystery from the sea. All their meager breasts panted together, the violently dilated nostrils quivered, the eyes stared stonily uphill. They passed me within 6 inches, without a glance, with the complete, death-like indifference of unhappy savages. See, the Brussels Conference Act of 1890 outlawed the slave trade in Africa. And for the most part, European and Western ideas of slavery had turned sour by this time. But see, the Europeans weren't going to let something like legality get in the way of slavery. So no, they wouldn't take people and force them into chains and make them do their labor. They would take criminals and force them into chains and to do their labor. What were the laws they broke, you may ask? Well, stuff we don't like violence or theft or not meeting mandated profits. Similar to how the French attacking the jungle referred to the invisible threat as their enemies, all they had to do at this station is apply the label of criminal and slavery's back on the menu. But there's an interesting sight in the mix of these chained men. Behind this raw matter, one of the reclaimed, the product of the new forces at work, strolled despondently, carrying a rifle by its middle. He had a uniform jacket with one button off, and seeing a white man on the path, hoisted his weapon onto his shoulder with alacrity. This was simple prudence, white men being so much alike at a distance that he could not tell who I might be. He was speedily reassured, and with a large, white, rascally grin and a glance at his charge, seemed to take me into partnership in his exalted trust. After all, I also was a part of the great cause of these high and just proceedings. So there's another black man at the group of the people in chains, only this one's in a uniform carrying a rifle. That's because he is hired by the company to transport these slaves, criminals, onto their next duty. Marlow identifies him as one of the reclaimed, as if to say, sure, this guy was lost in the darkness of Africa, but now he's one of us, as opposed to the men in chains who he previously referred to as unhappy savages. And when the man with the rifle smiles at him, Marlow says, of course, as he is a part of these high and just proceedings. This is one of the most on-the-nose comments we get through the whole story. For the most part, Joseph Conrad hides his hand. Several of the events are very concretely from Marlow's perspective, And Marlow seems to be someone fully committed to the European idea. Any of his mistrust in the company does not mean he has a mistrust in this great colonization or these high and just proceedings. So our understandings of subtext have to be picked out from the events within the story rather than Marlow's commentary on the events within the story. And Conrad using the phrase high and just for when Marlow describes seeing 6 people in chains seems to be a pretty sarcastic commentary of how criminals were treated at this time. Now, that's not to say I think Joseph Conrad would be one for one with current sensibilities or anything, but I think his true intentions with this book, which we'll talk about later, are certainly on display if you look close enough. And it's also worth noting that the outdated language is from Marlow's perspective, a perspective that is purposefully one to represent the idealism of the European colonization. So in other words, just because Marlow says something doesn't mean that's the point or the objective truth. And I think that's certainly on display by the phrasing of high and just proceedings. Oddly, Marlow begins to re-argue that he let this chain gang walk further along the trail, stating that although he's tough, something about this site bothered him. And then he says something that is foreshadowing for events later in our story. I've seen the devil of violence, and the devil of greed, and the devil of hot desire, but by all the stars, these were strong, lusty, red-eyed devils that swayed and drove men. Men, I tell you. But as I stood on this hillside, I foresaw that in the blinding sunshine of that land, I would become equated with a flabby, pretending, weak-eyed devil of a rapacious and pitiless folly. How insidious he could be, too. I was only to find out several months later and 1,000 miles farther. For a moment I stood appalled, as though by a warning. Finally, I descended the hill obliquely towards the trees I had seen. It's almost like he has a feeling in his gut. Something is telling him that there is a presence out here that he has yet to come across. Devils, as he calls them, that drive men to these links. But nevertheless, just like all the warning signs before, Marlow keeps going. Marlow continues walking to the trees and finds himself some shade. But as he steps into the shade, he sees this, something more disturbing than the enslaved men he saw earlier. Black shapes crouched, sat between the trees, leaning against the trunks, clinging to the earth, half coming out, half effaced within the dim light, in all the attitudes of pain, abandonment, and despair. Another mine on the cliff went off, followed by a slight shudder of the soil under my feet. The work was going on. The work. And this was the place where some of the helpers had withdrawn to die. They were dying slowly. It was very clear. They were not enemies. They were not criminals. They were nothing earthly now. Nothing but black shadows of disease and starvation lying confusedly in the greenish gloom. Brought from all the recesses of the coast and all the legality of time contracts, lost in uncongenial surroundings, fed on unfamiliar food, they sickened, became inefficient, and were then allowed to crawl away and rest. These moribund shapes were free as air, nearly as thin. I began to distinguish the gleam of the eyes under the trees. Then, glancing down, I saw a face near my hand. The black bones reclined at full length with one shoulder against the tree, and slowly the eyelids rose and the sunken eyes looked up at me, enormous and vacant, a kind of blind, white flicker in the depths of the orbs, which died out slowly. The man seemed young, almost a boy, but you know with him it's hard to tell. I found nothing else to do but to offer him one of my good Swede ship's biscuits I had in my pocket. The fingers closed slowly on it and held. There was no other movement and no other glance. He had tied a bit of white worsted round his neck. Why? Where did he get it? Was it a badge, an ornament, a charm, a proprietary act? Was there any idea at all connected with it? It looked startling round his black neck. This bit of white thread from beyond the seas. Again, more of the evils of this European betterment are painted with a weight of sarcasm. These people have been brought from all around Africa and made to work on the railroads and the mines. Brought in with all the legality of time contracts, as Marlow says. Legally, these are just workers here on a job, but clearly that's not where this has left them. They were worked to the bone, to the point where, as Marlow says, they're as free as air. Because of course, they're no longer useful to the company, so the company's allowed them to crawl away and die. There's something so understated about that mention of the white fabric around the guy's neck. Maybe the white fabric was to denote who he was working for or what shift of workers he was on. Or maybe it was just a piece of white fabric he found and wanted to tie around his neck. Either way, when Marlow's looking at it, it bothers him. It's like if it weren't for that fabric, Marlow could detach his responsibility with what he's witnessing. It's an African dying in Africa, something that otherwise Marlow would just be bearing witness of. But that white fabric, something specifically from overseas, as Marlow mentions, the presence of that indicates that something's different here. That this man is not dying of his own volition or his own influence, but something from across the seas has now put him in this condition. And that same something is what Marlow is now part of. Marlow describes this man as one dying of many. He says that he is horror-struck, so he leaves the shade and walks up to the station. It's there he sees a white man who is dressed so elegantly, at first, Marlow thinks him to be a vision. He has a starched collar, white cuffs, and an alpaca jacket. It turns out this guy is the company's accountant, and he stepped outside for some fresh air. The juxtaposition here is great. We just saw Marlow witnessing people in the shade breathing in their final moments, next to an accountant wearing more money than they'll ever see stepping out into the sun because it's stuffy in his office. A lot of the themes of the book are probably pretty apparent to you already, but keep things like this in mind for the end. For 10 days, Marlow stays at this station. The only person he really talks to is the accountant. While Marlow's there, there's a sick person in a room next to the accountant who's dying of some illness, and the accountant remarks of this person that their groans annoy him. Moments like these make me think back to Marlow's aunt describing such a righteous endeavor, a righteousness that feels mostly annoyance for the people dying around them. However, while talking about his time with the accountant, Marlow says this. One day he remarked, without lifting his head, "In the interior you will no doubt meet Mr. Kurtz." On my asking who Mr. Kurtz was, he said he was a first-class agent. And seeing my disappointment at this information, he added slowly, laying down his pen, "He is a very remarkable person." Further questions elicited from him that Mr. Kurtz was at present in charge of a trading post, a very important one, in the true ivory country. At the very bottom of there, sends in as much ivory as all the others put together. He began to write again. The sick man was too ill to groan. The flies buzzed in a great peace. This is our first mention of Mr. Kurtz. We don't know a lot about him yet, but Mr. Kurtz seems to be really good at his job. As mentioned, the ivory trade was brutal, and Mr. Kurtz seems to be thriving at it, sending in more ivory than all the other posts combined. All we hear of him so far is that Kurtz is a very remarkable person, and this certainly won't be the last time we hear his name mentioned. While they're talking, a loud caravan of traders arrives. While they're speaking, the accountant refers to them as savages. Savages that he says hinder his work. The accountant then, for some reason, shifts the conversation back to Kurtz. "When you see Mr. Kurtz," he went on, "tell him from me that everything here," he glanced at the deck, "is very satisfactory. I don't like to write to him. With those messengers of ours, you never know who may get a hold of your letter at the central station." He stared at me for a moment with his mild, bulging eyes. "Oh, he will go far, very far," he began again. "He will be a somebody in the administration before long. They, above the council in Europe, you know, mean him to be." For whatever reason, this accountant cares what Mr. Kurtz thinks of him. I mean, this guy's an accountant for the whole company, but he really cares about what one guy way upriver at a trading post thinks of him, alluding to the idea that Kurtz will become some esteemed figure in Europe, almost giving a mythic quality to him, saying that people above the European Council favor him. Once again, this won't be the last we hear of him. So now that Marlow is at this station, he's to take a caravan by land to the station he's supposed to get his steamboat at. This caravan is to travel 200 miles. He's to travel on the caravan with 60 workers, each carrying 60-pound loads. While on this caravan, Marlow sees some interesting sights. Once a white man in an unbuttoned uniform, camping on the path with an armed escort of lank Zanzibaris, very hospitable and festive, not to say drunk, was looking after the upkeep of the road, he declared. "Can't say I saw any road or any upkeep, unless the body of a middle-aged black with a bullet hole in the forehead, upon which I absolutely stumbled 3 miles farther on, may be considered as a permanent improvement." Again, random examples of the insanity of this work or progress they're doing. He's traveling with one other white guy from the company, a guy that remarks he's only here to make money, when that guy falls ill and now has to be carried. So he gives a speech to the workers, and once again, worker is a strong word, He doesn't say what the speech is about, probably something about maintaining dignity and looking after each other, and then makes a group of them carry the sick guy on a stretcher. And they carry the sick guy on ahead, and then it says, "An hour afterwards, I came upon the whole concern wrecked in a bush. Man, hammock, groans, blankets, horrors. The heavy pole had skinned his poor nose. He was very anxious for me to kill somebody, but there wasn't the shadow of a carrier near. I remembered the old doctor. It would be interesting for science to watch the mental changes of individuals on the spot." I felt I was becoming scientifically interesting. That's probably the only funny beat in the whole book. He gives a whole speech about why they need to carry this guy, and they literally threw him in a bush. And from there, he mentions most of the people just ran away. I mean, they were being forced to carry 60 pounds barefoot for 200 miles. I would also run away. But in contrast to the suffering they were going through carrying this stuff, he remarks of the guy in the cot that he skinned his nose, his poor nose. Very childlike and infantilizing compared to the suffering around him. But the visual of his stretcher getting tossed into a bush is the only thing we can smile at, probably, in this whole book. The comment from the doctor mentioning that it would be scientifically interesting to watch how people's minds change while they're out there, and Marlow says, "I am becoming scientifically interesting." After 15 days, Marlow comes to a place he calls the Central Station, the station where Marlow is supposed to get his boat and start his captain's voyage up the Congo. He remarks that the Central Station is kind of underwhelming. It's surrounded by smelly mud, and a neglected gap is what passes for a gate. Marlow remarks interestingly that it was clear at first glance that this place was ran by the Flabby Devil. The Flabby Devil being the thing he mentioned earlier that he saw in an almost vision of what was to come. As Marlow arrives at the station, he lets them know who he is, and one of the men tells Marlow that his ship is sunk. Marlow is obviously upset by this, but the guy keeps telling Marlow that it's okay. Marlow thinks that this is very not okay. He has come a long way to be the captain of a steamboat, and now he's told that that steamboat is underwater. The man keeps telling Marlow that it's okay, that the manager's here, whatever that means, and keeps insisting that Marlow needs to go talk to the manager. So Marlow does just that. Marlow goes to speak with this general manager, but immediately notices something off. Outwardly, all of his characteristics are normal. He has blue eyes, dark hair, is an ordinary size and build. At first, nothing's out of place. However, it seems every time the manager speaks, he ends his phrases with a sort of smile. Not exactly a smile, something unidentifiable, as Marlow says. It's as if everything he says is sealed by this strange smirk. Furthermore, he says he doesn't inspire confidence or hatred in his men. Instead, the only thing he seems to inspire is uneasiness, as if everyone he spoke to was off guard. Marlow going on to say the manager is so plain, it's hard to understand how he got this job in the first place. Perhaps he just simply lasted the longest. As soon as Marlow meets the manager's in a hurry. He's stressed out about things. He hasn't heard anything from the stations further upriver. For all he knows, half of them are dead. As a matter of fact, the reason Marlow's ship is sank is because a few days prior, the manager, along with people who didn't know what they're doing, tried to take the boat upriver and tore out the bottom. Seems the manager was in such a hurry he was going to leave without the guy, Marlow, who was assigned captain. And while speaking about why there's such a concern, Marlow says this: "There were rumors that a very important station was in jeopardy, and its chief, Mr. Kurtz, was ill. Hoped it was not true. Mr. Kurtz was..." I felt weary and irritable. Hang Kurtz, I thought. I interrupted him by saying I had heard of Mr. Kurtz on the coast. "Ah, so they talk of him down there," he murmured to himself. Then he began again, assuring me Mr. Kurtz was the best agent he had, an exceptional man, of the greatest importance to the company. Therefore, I could understand his anxiety. He was, he said, very, very uneasy. Certainly, he fidgeted on his chair a good deal, exclaimed, "Ah, Mr. Kurtz," broke the stick of sealing wax and seemed dumbfounded by the accident. Next thing he wanted to know how long it would take to... I interrupted him again. Being hungry, and kept on my feet too, I was getting savage. Again, we hear mention of this Mr. Kurtz, someone who the general manager speaks of freely for a moment, but then when he finds out that Marlow knows of him, talking about how Mr. Kurtz is the very best of their men. He almost seems nervous talking about him, breaking a stick of wax. Kurtz's name has a weight to it, but it seems to mean different things to different people. From here, Marlow is outside, and he looks at the central station. While looking at the station itself, Marlow remarks, "And outside, the silent wilderness surrounding this cleared speck on the earth struck me as something great and invincible, like evil or truth, waiting patiently for the passing away of this fantastic invasion." The phrase fantastic invasion is another interesting way to describe Marlow's idealized view of this colonialism, but he refers to the jungle around it as some sort of truth, something that is always there and just waiting for this moment in time, the Europeans' moment, to be over. The process of repairing the steamer is slow. It seems the thing wasn't completely sunk, but was sunk enough to be unmovable. So they have to dredge it up to dry ground and then use metal to repair the hole, something that wouldn't be easy to do in the midst of industrialization in the 1890s, much less in the middle of the Congo. So during his time at the central station, Marlow describes some of the things he saw there. One night, a small hut caught on fire, and Marlow went over to watch. As he was watching the fire, several of the European men were beating an African man who they say caused it. Marlow remarking that several days later, after the man had recovered, that he stood up and walked into the wilderness, which took him into its bosom again. As Marlow's watching the fire, he hears someone mention Kurtz. He doesn't hear that detail of the conversation, but sees that it was taking place between the manager and a young agent of the company. When Marlow walks up, the manager leaves, but the agent sticks around. Marlow describes this agent as devilish in appearance. He has a hooked nose and a pointy beard. None of the other agents trust him because they believe that he's a spy for the general manager, reporting anything the other workers do against the manager, which adds on to that air of uneasiness the manager gives off that was mentioned earlier. The agent takes Marlow into his hut, and Marlow sees that the agent has a silver dressing case and a candle, things that are only supposed to be had by the manager of the station. Marlow says that this agent's profession was that of a brickmaker, which is weird considering there are no bricks anywhere. And this agent has been here for over a year. The agent says he's waiting on something to start making the bricks, but again, it's been over a year and he hasn't made any. While remarking on the central station, Marlow says this: "There was an air of plotting about that station, but nothing came of it, of course. It was as unreal as everything else, as the philanthropic pretense of the whole concern, as their talk, as their government, as their show of work. The only real feeling was a desire to get appointed to a trading post where ivory was to be had so that they could earn percentages. They intrigued and slandered and hated each other only on that account. But as to effectually lifting a little finger, oh no, by heavens. There's something, after all, in the world, allowing one man to steal a horse while another must not look at a halter. Steal a horse straight out, very well. He has done it. Perhaps he can ride. But there is a way of looking at a halter that would provoke the most charitable of saints into a kick." Everyone at the station is described with an almost Luciferian verbiage. The general manager, who appears plain but seals his words with a smile. Everyone around him's uneasy, and then he has this assistant who seems to be scheming and plotting amongst his co-partners. But nevertheless, nothing comes of this scheming. It's all unreal. And then Conrad, or Marlow, adds another on-the-nose description by saying it's unreal as the philanthropic pretense of the whole concern. As mentioned, the King of Belgium says they're here to help the local people to spread prosperity with Africa. But of course, from everything we've seen, Africans aren't the one making the money. Sure, Belgium was supposed to give them railroads and infrastructure, but all that's amounted to at this point is dynamite explosions on top of cliffs. I like the way he phrases it too. One man can steal a horse, but another can't look at a halter. These businessmen come in and take everything, but if anything gets in the way of their ivory, it's a problem. The agent starts to ask Marlow a lot of questions about who he knows back in Europe. And Marlow figures out why the agent's talking to him now and why the general manager was so cautious around him earlier. Because if you'll remember, Marlow got this job because his aunt put in a good word with the government. So even though Marlow doesn't have any real connections, everyone at this station thinks he has really good connections. Marlow doesn't say he's not important, but as the conversation continues, it leads nowhere. So as Marlow is about to leave, he says this: "I rose. Then I noticed a small sketch in oils on a panel representing a woman draped and blindfolded, carrying a lighted torch. The background was somber, almost black. The movement of the woman was stately, and the effect of the torchlight on the face was sinister. It arrested me, and he stood by civilly, holding an empty half-pint champagne bottle, medical comforts, with the candle stuck in it. To my question, he said Mr. Kurtz had painted this in this very station more than a year ago, while waiting for means to go to his trading post. "Tell me, pray," said I, "who is this Mr. Kurtz, the chief of the interstation?" He answered in a short tone, looking away. "Much obliged," I said, laughing. "And you are the brickmaster of the central station. Everyone knows that." He was silent for a while. "He is a prodigy," he said at last. "He is an emissary of pity and science and progress. The devil knows what else. We want," he began to declaim suddenly, "for the guidance of the cause entrusted to us by Europe, so to speak, higher intelligence, wide sympathies, singleness of purpose." "Who says that?" I asked. "Lots of them," he replied. "Some even write that. And so he comes here, a special being, as you ought to know." "Why ought I to know?" I interrupted, really surprised. He paid no attention. "Yes, today he is chief of the best station. Next year he will be assistant manager. 2 years more and... But I dare say you know what he will be in 2 years' time. You are of the new gang, the gang of virtue. The same people who sent him specially also recommended you." "Oh, don't say no. I've mine own eyes to trust." Light dawned upon me. My dear aunt's influential acquaintances were producing an unexpected effect upon that young man. I nearly burst into a laugh. "Do you read the company's confidential correspondence?" I asked. He hadn't a word to say. It was great fun. "When Mr. Kurtz," I continued severely, "is general manager, you won't have the opportunity." Again, there's a sainthood attributed to Kurtz. He made a painting of a blindfolded woman walking with a torch. A torch made to light the darkness, a symbol of justice. It seems Kurtz is talented in everything, from the ivory trade to art, and this company agent treats him like a missionary. He's sent here by virtue. Next year he'll be assistant manager, then after that, on to bigger things. As they step outside and Marlow walks back to his steamboat, the agent says, "My dear sir, I don't want to be misunderstood, and especially by you, who will see Mr. Kurtz long before I can have that pleasure. I wouldn't like him to get a false idea of my disposition." This agent spoke only good things of Kurtz, but is now worried that Kurtz won't think highly of him. Whoever this guy is, he's made quite the impression on everyone he's come across. Marlow's getting tired of this. He refers to Kurtz as a papier-mâché Mephistopheles. Mephistopheles is the messenger for the devil in the German story Faust, the classic tale that popularized the notion of selling your soul to the devil. Drawing this comparison, Marlow is saying this entire station seems indebted to him. They simultaneously fear and respect him as if he's some supernatural figure. Marlow talks at this point about how Mr. Kurtz was a strange idea to him. It was the same as someone describing an angel or a demon or an alien on Mars. You might have an image in your head of what those things look like, but it's not something you've seen, and therefore it's something you've put a face to. While describing a man who would fight you if you made fun of his belief in aliens, Marlow says something very interesting and very important to our end analysis. "I would not have gone so far as to fight for Kurtz, but I went for him near enough to a lie. You know, I hate, detest, and can't bear a lie. Not because I am straighter than the rest of us, but simply because it appalls me. There's a taint of death, a flavor of morality in lies, which is exactly what I hate and detest in the world, what I want to forget. It makes me miserable and sick, like biting something rotten would do. Temperament, I suppose. Well, I went near enough to it by letting the young fool there believe anything he liked to imagine as to my influence in Europe. I became in an instant as much of a pretense as the rest of the bewitched pilgrims, simply because I had a notion it somehow would be of help to that Kurtz, whom at the time I did not see. You understand. He was just a word for me. I did not see the man in the name any more than you do. Do you see him? Do you see the story? Do you see anything? It seems to me I am trying to tell you a dream, making a vain attempt, because no relation of a dream can convey the dream sensation, that commingling of absurdity, surprise, and bewilderment, and a tremor of struggling revolt, that notion of being captured by the incredible which is of the very essence of dreams. He was silent for a while. No, it is impossible. It's impossible to convey the life sensation of any given epoch of one's existence. That which makes it truth its meaning, its subtle and penetrating essence. It's impossible. We live as we dream, alone. He paused again as if reflecting, then added, "Of course, in this, you fellows see more than I could then. You see me, whom you know." A lot of interesting things to note here. For one, this is the first point in the story that Marlow's narration is broken. Remember, everything we've seen of this African story has been from Marlow. But Marlow's not the one who is narrating the book. It is someone listening to Marlow on a boat. And at this mention of dreams, for the first time, that narrator speaks and says he was silent for a while, referring to Marlow talking about this tale. Marlow is so desperate to convey what he thought of Kurtz at this time that he begins speaking to the listener directly. And he asks questions he knows the answer to. Do you see the story? Do you see Kurtz? Do you see anything I'm describing to you? No, you're simply listening and putting it together in your head. But at least we know him, at least you watching this video know I. There's some connection between yourself and the narrator. But with Kurtz, Marlow had nothing. Kurtz was an idea, a concept that was becoming manifest in his head. And this bothers him because it's starting to work. Marlow talks about how much he hates lies, how there's a morality to them, something so betraying, to look at truth in life and turn away from it. But nevertheless, Marlow did lie, or at least avoided the truth, by not telling the agent that he actually wasn't some high-ranking European figure. Because for a split second, he thought it might favor Kurtz. That if this agent thinks Marlow and Kurtz are cut from the same cloth, perhaps that'll be good. Someone who Marlow has never heard of before his visit here is beginning to influence his actions. The narrator of this whole story, while listening to Marlow speak, remarks that at this point on the boat, it's so dark he can't see the people sitting around him. For all he knows, they're all asleep and he's the only one listening. Or everyone is listening and is too engaged in the story to speak. Marlow's disinterested in the station and spends pretty much all of his time on the steamboat. They've brought it up to where it's half on shore and he sleeps and lives on that thing. He needs a certain amount of rivets to repair the hull of the ship, and he remarks that on the coast of Africa there were rivets everywhere. He could have got handfuls of them. But here in the interior, it seems impossible to get even one. So he starts writing letters to send to the coast demanding that they bring rivets here. But nevertheless, it takes months for any to arrive. At one point, the people at the station get afraid because a hippo is living on the side of the wreckage of the steamboat. But Marlow says the hippo doesn't really seem interested in bothering anyone, so he doesn't care. But anytime the hippo makes its way around the steamboat to go on land, people freak out. And some of the pilgrims, as he refers to them, which these pilgrims are people from Europe who are trying to come to Africa and settle in the region. Anytime the hippo comes around, the pilgrims freak out and shoot at it and throw spears, and the hippo just calmly goes back into the water. Similar to the jungle itself, it seems nature views them as temporary. Marlow does remark during this time that he enjoyed the work. Not labor itself, but what work brought. He said it gave him a chance to find himself. Your own reality for yourself, not for others, what no other man can ever know. The one friend that Marlow's made at this time is one of the mechanics, an older man with a beard down to his waist who loves to talk about pigeons. He would help Marlow work on the steamboat and was the only person who really kept him company at the central station. After hearing rivets are on their way, he goes to the mechanic and says this. I slapped him on the back and shouted, "We shall have rivets!" He scrambled to his feet exclaiming, "No, rivets?" As though he couldn't believe his ears. Then in a low voice, I don't know why we behaved like lunatics. I put my finger to the side of my nose and nodded mysteriously. Good for you, he cried, snapped his fingers above his head, lifted one foot. I tried a jig. We capered on the iron deck. A frightful clatter came out of that hulk, and the virgin forest on the other bank of the creek sent it back in a thundering roll upon the sleeping station. Marlow has a joviousness here, but it's not in the Europeans and it's not in the station, it's in his work, and it's in the person who he's found in his work. Despite what he said, though, it would still take quite some time for the rivets to get there. In the meantime, a group arrived at the station called the El Dorado Exploring Expedition. They kept talk of what they did quiet, but it seemed they're treasure hunters. Or at least treasure hunter is a nice word for them. As Marlow says, there was not an atom of foresight or of serious intention in the whole batch of them, and they did not seem aware that things are wanted from the work of the world. In other words, they're pirates, pillaging the land and taking whatever they see as valuable. But for the good of the king or the company or whatever. The reason they're here is because the leader of this expedition is the uncle of the general manager. While describing his time there, Marlow says, "I had plenty of time for meditation, and now and then I would give some thought to Kurtz. I wasn't very interested in him, no. Still, I was curious to see whether this man, who had come out equipped with moral ideas of some sort, would climb to the top after all, and how he would set about his work when there." Marlow doesn't realize it, but he's doing the same thing with Kurtz that everyone else is doing. He's attributing these great thoughts of morality and virtue to someone he's never met. Someone who had come out with moral ideas, as he says. Now he's thinking to himself, I wonder what kind of great things that guy will do after he leaves here. It seems there is something about a thought of someone being in the same predicament but becoming better that interests him. One day, Marlow is laying down on the deck of the steamboat and he hears two men talking. It seems this is the general manager and his uncle walking down the shore while speaking to each other, and the two don't realize that Marlow is on the boat. And it seems that the two men are talking about Mr. Kurtz. The general manager is upset at Kurtz for some reason. He says he doesn't like being dictated to, and he was ordered to send Kurtz out there. His uncle clarifies that Kurtz asked the administration, I assume the administration of the whole company, to send him out there. His uncle says, look at the influence that man must have. Is it not frightful? While speaking about their uneasiness regarding Kurtz, the uncle says, the climate may do away with this difficulty for you. Is he alone there? This sounds like, despite the great stories of Kurtz, that these two are plotting to kill him. The general manager says, he sent his assistant down the river with a note to me in these terms. Clear this poor devil out of the country, and don't bother sending more of that sort. I'd rather be alone than have the kind of men you can dispose of with me. It was more than a year ago. Can you imagine such impudence? Anything since then? Asked the other hoarsely. Ivory, jerked the nephew. Lots of it. Prime sort. Lots. Most annoying from him. And with that, questioned the heavy rumble. Invoice, was the reply fired out, so to speak. Then silence. So Kurtz has isolated himself at his own station, saying he didn't like the kind of men the company were sending, so he'd rather just be left to himself. And in response, more and more ivory keep showing up at the station. Kurtz seems to be doing just fine by himself, but he's gone AWOL as far as the company's concerned. The manager said that the ivory arrived being carried on canoes by Africans. The Africans being led by a half-caste English, as the manager describes him, who is under Kurtz's authority. This clerk, as the manager refers to him, said that Kurtz was going to bring the ivory himself. Remember that this station is over 1,000 miles downriver. But after only 300 miles, Kurtz decided to turn around, having 4 paddlers take him back, while the clerk and all of the Africans who were delivering the ivory continued on to the station. While hearing of this, Marlow says this, I seemed to see Kurtz for the first time. It was a distinct glimpse. The dugout, 4 paddling savages, and the lone white man turning his back suddenly on the headquarters, on relief, on thoughts of home, perhaps setting his face towards the depths of the wilderness, towards his empty and desolate station. I did not know the motive. Perhaps he was just simply a fine fellow who stuck to his work for its own sake. His name, you understand, had not been pronounced once. He was that man, the half-caste who, as far as I could see, had conducted a difficult trip with great prudence and pluck, was invariably alluded to as that scoundrel. The scoundrel had reported that the man had been very ill, had recovered imperfectly. This clerk or assistant of Kurtz is described as a scoundrel, someone wicked, getting in the way of the company's business. And they won't even say Kurtz's name, they just refer to him as that man. That's the kind of weight his presentation has. We also have another instance of the Africans being referred to as savages. But I think this description, specifically here, will hold weight later in the story, especially given the mention of this white man amongst the savages. We also see here that Marlow is beginning to relate his own experience to Kurtz. While working on the steamboat, he talked about how he can become lost in the work. He likes what the work brings him. And while thinking of why Kurtz decided to turn back, he was supposed to come home, but instead went back up the Congo, he says perhaps he's a fine fellow who stuck to his work for its own sake. And for the past year, Kurtz has been off the grid. But as the clerk or scoundrel mentioned, the one who brought the ivory down for Kurtz, Kurtz had recently been sick and had not recovered well. The two go on to say that there's a new person in Kurtz's district who is selling ivory. Well, that's company grounds, and this other person's not supposed to do that. So the two men decide that they're going to hang whoever's doing it to set an example. While speaking of Kurtz again, they talk about the absurdity of his talk. The manager says that each station should be like a beacon, leading up the river to better things, and then, as he says, but also for humanizing, improving, instructing. For one, that is the opposite of everything we've seen that these stations are doing to the Africans so far, but also it's hilarious to talk about how they're humanizing and improving the region after they just said they're going to hang the guy that's selling stuff that they're not profiting from. Again, the hypocrisy of it all is on full display. While talking, the uncle gestures to the jungle, and Marlow says, "It seemed to beckon with a dishonoring flourish before the sunlit face of the land, a treacherous appeal to the lurking death, to the hidden evil, to the profound darkness of its heart." Here we have the idea heart of darkness, or darkness of its heart, explicitly applied to the jungle. Again, the word darkness or imagery of darkness has been used to describe a foreboding evil or a wickedness at the core of something. And now Marlow is describing the jungle as having a darkness at its heart. When he first made his way to the African coastline, Marlow said that the trees are so dark green they appear almost black. Well, now he is not ascribing the jungle as simply dark, but as having some beating heart, some life force at the center of it all. Something that exudes darkness, and amongst all the plotting and legends of Mr. Kurtz, it's something Marlow's starting to feel. The uncle and manager walk away, and then Marlow says, "In a few days, the El Dorado expedition went into the patient wilderness, that closed upon it as the sea closes over a diver. Long afterwards, the news came that all the donkeys were dead. I know nothing as to the fate of the less valuable animals. They, no doubt, like the rest of us, found what they deserved. I did not inquire." So earlier, there's certainly some sarcasm that alludes to the colonialism and the company being wrong. But here, Marlow seems to despise the El Dorado expedition. He says that the donkeys are dead and he doesn't know about the less valuable animals, meaning the people, but that they simply got what they deserved and he didn't care to ask. It goes back to what Marlow said at the beginning of the story. The only thing that separates us from conquestors and brutes is our idea. Our idea that we're doing something better, that there's some objective at the end of this, because without that, you're just invaders. Marlow didn't like the El Dorado expedition because they betrayed that idea. They showed that the emperor has no clothes. They simply went to the African continent to steal and take what they wanted. Unlike the company that steals and takes what they want in the name of progress and betterment. They showed the facade for what it is, and according to Marlow, got what they deserved. Even if Marlow doesn't realize that he might as well be a part of the same expedition. Eventually, the steamboat gets working and Marlow becomes ship captain. He is to make his way up to Mr. Kurtz's station along with the general manager, several pilgrims, and several Africans hired to help run the ship, and also defend it. And from here, they set sail up the Congo on a journey that will last 2 months. Marlow says traveling up that river was like going back to the beginnings of the world. Big trees and dense vegetation, untouched by man. And he says while traveling up this river, he began to feel cut off from the world outside of it. Similar to his over-the-top tone with the mechanic, there's something about this river that makes him act different. As he says, there were moments when one's past came back to one, as it will sometimes. Although then, Marlow didn't have a lot of time to think on this. He spent most of his time worrying how to steer the boat, constantly afraid of underwater rocks or limbs or anything that could damage the already damaged hull. He said at several points the water was so shallow they would have to cut the boat and wade it through. So 20 of the locals, who Marlow says are cannibals, would hop out of the boat and hold on to it to take it through the shallow waters. Marlow remarks that these cannibals were fine men, and they were men one could work with, and I am grateful to them. As they made their way up the Congo, they would see a station from time to time. He says the further they went up the river, the more bizarre people behaved. All would be interested in the company or in ivory, but they would be louder, they would yell longer. He says everyone on the boat had their reasons for this voyage. The manager for the company, the pilgrims to find a station or a place to stay. But Marlow is only interested in Kurtz. He has to meet this man who he's heard so much of. So as Marlow says, we penetrated deeper and deeper into the heart of darkness. He describes going up the river and hearing drums, not knowing if these are drums for war, peace, or prayer. Every now and then they would come across a tribe by the river. Marlow remarks how strange it was to be in the midst of the river and to think you're the only people on the planet. You're in a land untouched by humanity, only to then come across humanity who's been in touch with it for some time. He remarks how those on the steamboat would think of themselves as dignified and the people on the shore as prehistoric. But when Marlow reminisces on this, he says, We cannot understand because we were too far, and cannot remember because we were traveling in the night of first ages, of those ages that are gone, leaving hardly a sign and no memories. The understanding that Marlow is seeking has been here for some time. Marlow says that so often we look at nature as something we've put in shackles, a thing that we can enjoy and witness, but something that isn't free. It's simply relegated as we want it to be. But here, nature is monstrous and it is free. While describing the Africans he sees ashore, Marlow says, "It was unearthly, and the men were... no, they were not inhuman. Well, that was the worst of it. The suspicion of their not being inhuman. It would come slowly to one. They howled and leaped and spun and made horrid faces, but what thrilled you was just the thought of their humanity. Like yours, the thought of your remote kinship with this wild and passionate uproar. Ugly. Yes, it was ugly enough. But if you were man enough, you would admit to yourself that there was in you just the faintest trace of a response to the terrible frankness of that noise, a dim suspicion of there being a meaning in it which you so remote from the night of first ages, could comprehend. And why not? The mind of man is capable of anything, because everything is in it. All the past as well as all the future. What was there after all? Joy, fear, sorrow, devotion, valor, rage, who can tell? But truth. Truth stripped of its cloak of time. Let the fool gape and shudder. The man knows and can look on without a wink. But he must at least be as much of a man as these on the shore. He must meet the truth with his own true stuff, with his own inborn strength. Principles won't do. Acquisitions, clothes, pretty rags that would fly off at the first good shake. Marlow is beginning to see through the veil that these people who he thinks himself so much better than are truly at touch with their humanity. As Marlow says, all of humanity has the same truths, just expressed in different ways. Joy, fear, sorrow. And the difference between those expressions is simply the cloak of time. As he says, clothes or pretty rags would fly off at the first good shake. Also, that quote, "The mind of man is capable of anything," is probably the most famous quote from this book. That and something Kurtz says later, which we'll talk about. Eventually, they find a hut that's 50 miles from Kurtz's station. The hut looks like it's been abandoned for some time. There's a tattered flagpole, and the structures that are there seem to be in ruin. However, at the bank is a large pile of firewood. Firewood that's needed to power the steamboat. Above the wood is a sign that reads, "Wood for you. Hurry up. Approach cautiously." This is ominous. They've been cautious this whole voyage, but what about this last 50-mile stretch is especially cautious? Is it even referring to Kurtz? Maybe someone set this up who is staying further past Kurtz's location. And the framing of this is bizarre. On the side of the jungle, a sign telling them to be careful and to hurry. It's as if someone was awaiting their arrival, as if this was all predicted. They go inside of the ruined hut, and the only thing of note is a book titled An Inquiry into Some Points on Seamanship. It's a very technical book talking about chains and ropes and some of the logistics needed in order to be a seaman. However, there's notes written in the margins of the page that, according to Marlow, seem to be ciphers. Now the mystery is all the more intense. Whoever set up this sign was reading a book about the logistics of traveling at sea and had written in code between the pages, a code that was maybe just meant for them or maybe meant for Marlow to find. The mysteries around Kurtz just get weirder and weirder. When they get back on the boat, the general manager remarks that it must be the intruder, the person who the manager thinks is selling ivory on company grounds, or Kurtz's grounds. Again, while Marlow is thinking of all these things about humanity and Kurtz, the manager is just concerned about the company. Marlow begins to think on this and think of what his own position will be once they get there. I mean, Marlow's just a hired captain. He doesn't have any authority on behalf of the company or on behalf of Kurtz. He's basically just transporting the general manager there. So Marlow begins to think of this and think, will he even get to speak to Kurtz? Should he even speak to Kurtz? And then he says this, "But before I could come to any conclusion, it occurred to me that my speech or my silence, indeed any action of mine, would be a mere futility. What did it matter what anyone knew or ignored? What did it matter who was manager? One gets sometimes such a flash of insight. The essentials of this affair lay deep under the surface, beyond my reach, beyond my power of meddling. We're starting to see the strict order of things, much like the clothes or pretty rags that Marlow mentioned earlier, shake off. What does it matter if the general manager's in charge, or if Marlow knows secrets on behalf of the company and shouldn't divulge company secrets? Once they get to Kurtz, they're just men in the jungle. Men who can say and do whatever they want. It becomes dark when they're about 8 miles from Kurtz's station, so they decide to put down anchor and stop in the night. The water's been shallow, and it would be dangerous to try to take the boat up in the dark. The next morning, the steamboat is surrounded by a thick fog, and through the fog, they hear a loud yell, followed by shouting and chanting in unknown languages all around them. The river was very narrow at this point. They were within speaking distance with either shore. But whoever's out there, they can't see through the fog. The pilgrims on the boat freak out and grab their rifles and go stand at ready around the edges of the ship. Marlow remarks that the whites among them are obviously scared, but the Africans are not scared, yet on alert. They're more accustomed to what might be out there, but this is still 800 miles away from their home. Marlow walks up to the leader of the cannibals and says, "Aha!" which is, I guess, him trying to start a conversation. And the cannibal leader tells Marlow they should catch him. Marlow asks why they should catch him, referring to whoever made the war cry from the side of the river. And the cannibal says, so they can eat him. And it's for the first time that Marlow realizes these guys are pretty hungry. When they first got on the boat, the cannibals had brought this huge chunk of hippo meat, but the hippo meat went bad and started to smell terrible, so they threw it over the boat. And since then, they were given a currency of brass wire to trade at the stations they came across for food. But most of the stations they came across were abandoned or didn't have any food. And this whole time, they've been getting by on dough and scraps. So standing here next to the hungry leader, Marlow thinks, why haven't they just ate us? I mean, they outnumbered the Europeans on board 5-1, and they're far more accustomed to fighting or far stronger. It wouldn't even be a challenge, but for some reason, they haven't. Marlow looks at the fat pilgrims and their unshapely nature and thinks maybe they're just unappetizing. But then Marlow says hunger is something near impossible to overcome. True hunger will reduce man to his most primal instincts. But yet, while Marlow thought of these cannibals on board as primal, he saw their illiteracy and filed teeth, as he described, something closer to a hyena, but yet here they are showing restraint, showing composure. It goes back to what Marlow said watching the natives on the shores of the river. His realization that something he previously considered inhuman is far more human than he thought. And it's right after Marlow describes how his faculties are fading away by ideas of managers and captains and roles and order. He realizes that the principles, the restraint of these cannibals, someone he thought of as lesser, remain. While they're standing there in the fog, the general manager walks up to Marlow and says, I would be desolated if anything should happen to Mr. Kurtz before we came up. Now, normally Marlow would know this to not be the case. He heard the manager speaking to his uncle about wanting Kurtz gone. But in this moment, Marlow says he believes the general manager because the general manager is the kind of guy that wouldn't want something to happen to Kurtz in order to keep up the company's appearance. I mean, how bad would it look if their best ivory guy was killed by the natives? That's not the kind of place you send more colonizers to. Marlow says an interesting line comparing the manager to the cannibals. He says he was just the kind of man who would wish to preserve appearances. That was his restraint. Saying that as the cannibals do not give in to hunger when they can, Marlow does not give in to what he wants if it hurts the company. For a while, they sat in this standoff, in the midst of a fog that isn't moving. They can't see the shores, but whoever's on the shore can't see them. But as soon as the fog begins to lift, the steamboat begins to move forward, nothing happens. They continue until they're only about 1.5 miles from Kurtz's station. They get to a spot where the river narrows considerably. So Marlow has to take the ship all the way to the side of the bank. He describes that for most of the voyage, he as the captain has been walking around the top deck of the ship, seeing where there's rocks in the water, seeing where the water gets shallow. And most of the time, the person behind the wheel is a helmsman, a local African. He says initially this young man had no idea how to drive a boat and only spoke a little English. But over this long voyage, he had gotten better and better at it. And while they were never comrades, something close to a kinship was forming between the captain and this helmsman. Well, it's while standing at the wheel next to the helmsman, Marlow sees the pole man, the guy that holds a pole on the edge of the boat to test how deep the water is, suddenly lays down. At the same time, several of the Africans on board duck their heads. As Marlow and the Europeans have no idea what's going on, he sees little sticks flying towards them and realizes, oh, we're being shot at with arrows. They're pushed up so close to the bank that when Marlow looks to his side, he can see the natives running through the trees firing arrows at them. The helmsman begins to freak out and yell. This is at a really bad time because in combination with everything else that's going on, there's a large snag in the river ahead. So Marlow pushes the helmsman off the wheel and begins to steer himself. At the same time, all of the pilgrims on board begin to shoot their rifles. They have no idea what they're shooting at and are just firing rounds into the brush. The only thing this accomplishes is filling the deck and the steering cabin with smoke, making it even harder for Marlow to navigate. The helmsman, in a panic, grabs a rifle that's in the bridge and throws open the shutter doors, firing into the woods. As he does, a spear flies through the window and strikes the helmsman in the chest. The helmsman falls to the ground and blood begins to pool at Marlow's feet. As he looks down at the helmsman, who is clutching the spear, gasping his final breaths. The pilgrims continue to fire off rounds. It's getting too hard to see through the smoke, so Marlow blows the whistle on the boat to get them to stop. As soon as he blows the whistle, the attack from the shore ceases. He looks out the window to see the people previously firing arrows running back into the jungle. At the same time, one of the pilgrims runs up to the bridge. He's wearing pink pajamas to further offset their appearance to the reality around them. As the pilgrim runs in, they both stand over the helmsman as he lay dying. We two whites stood over him, and his lustrous and inquiring glance enveloped us both. I declare it looked as though he would presently put us to some questions in an understandable language. But he died without uttering a sound, without moving a limb, without twitching a muscle. Only at the very last moment, as though in response to some sign we could not see, some whisper we could not hear, he frowned heavily. And that frown gave to his black death mask an inconceivably somber, brooding, and menacing expression. The luster of inquiring glance faded swiftly into vacant glassiness. Marlow has blood all over his shoes and socks and wants to change them immediately. He makes the pilgrim take the wheel while he goes outside and ditches his shoes. And while doing this, Marlow says this, "And by the way, I suppose Mr. Kurtz is dead as well by this time." For the moment, that was the dominant thought. There was a sense of extreme disappointment, as though I had found out I had been striving after something altogether without a substance. I couldn't have been more disgusted if I had traveled all this way for the sole purpose of talking with Mr. Kurtz. I flung one shoe overboard and became aware that was exactly what I had been looking forward to. A talk with Kurtz. I made the strange discovery that I had never imagined him as doing, but as discoursing. I didn't say to myself, now I will never see him, or now I will never shake him by the hand, but now I will never hear him. The man presented himself as a voice. Not, of course, that I did not connect him with some sort of action. Hadn't I been told in all the tones of jealousy and admiration that he had collected, bartered, swindled, or stolen more ivory than all the other agents together? That was not the point. The point was in his being a gifted creature, and that of all his gifts, the one that stood out preeminently, that carried with it a sense of real presence, was his ability to talk, his words, the gift of expression, the bewildering, the illuminating, the most exalted, and the most contemptible, the pulsating stream of light, or the deceitful flow from the heart of an impenetrable darkness. The mythology of Kurtz has worked on Marlow. This entire journey, Marlow has been deconstructing the world around him and seeing how it's constructed by those he's around. He sees this jungle as something untamable and the people who abide in it as understanding some secret he's trying to grasp. And then he hears of Kurtz, a man not only from his own position, but someone that, as the agent at the central station had mentioned, was sent by the same group Marlow was sent from. They're two men cut from the same cloth. And it seems all these questions Marlow has could be answered by Kurtz. He's a man everyone looks up to and everyone admires. He seems to know something that everyone wants to hear. And Marlow seems to hope that he has the answers to all of Marlow's questions. But now with this attack only 1.5 miles from Kurtz's station, surely he must be dead. It's at this point in the narrative that Marlow stops again. Not Marlow's story in the jungle, but Marlow telling people this entire story on a boat outside of England stops his story to refill his tobacco pipe. As he begins speaking again, he is now addressing the people he is telling this entire tale to on the boat at the Thames. He says the men probably think of him and his devotion to this man he's never met as absurd. And then he says, "My dear boys, what can you expect from a man who out of sheer nervousness had just flung overboard a pair of new shoes? And while describing how he felt about Kurtz then to the men around him, an older Marlow says this: "He was very little more than a voice, and I heard him, it, the voice, other voices, all of them were so little more than voices, and the memory of that time itself lingers around me, impalpable, like a dying vibration of one immense jabber, silly, atrocious, sordid, savage, or simply mean, without any kind of sense. Voices, voices, even the girl herself. Now," he was silent for a long time, "I laid the ghost of his gifts at last with a lie." He began suddenly. "Girl? What? Did I mention a girl? Oh, she is out of it. Completely. The women, are out of it. Should be out of it. We must help them to stay in that beautiful world of their own, lest ours get worse. Oh, she had to be out of it. You should have heard the disinterred body of Mr. Kurtz saying, 'My intended.' You would have perceived directly then how completely she was out of it. And the lofty frontal bone of Mr. Kurtz, they say the hair goes on growing sometimes, but this specimen was impressively bald. The wilderness had patted him on the head, and behold, it was like a ball, an ivory ball. It had caressed him, and lo, he had withered. It had taken him, loved him, embraced him, got into his veins, consumed his flesh, and sealed his soul to its own by the inconceivable ceremonies of some devilish initiation. He was its spoiled and pampered favorite. Ivory, I should think so. Heaps of it, stacks of it. The old mud shanty was bursting with it. You would think there was not a single tusk left either above or below the ground in the whole country. Mostly fossil, the manager had remarked disparagingly. It was no more fossil than I am, but they call it fossil when it's dug up. It appears these Africans do bury the tusk sometimes, but evidently they couldn't bury this parcel deep enough to save the gifted Mr. Kurtz from his fate. We filled the steamboat with it, and had to pile a lot on the deck. Thus he could see and enjoy as long as he could see, because the appreciation of this favor had remained with him to the last. You should have heard him say, 'My ivory.' Oh yes, I heard him. 'My intended, my ivory, my station, my river, my..." Everything belonged to him. It made me hold my breath in expectation of hearing the wilderness burst into a prodigious peal of laughter that would shake the fixed stars in their places. Everything belonged to him. But that was a trifle. The thing was to know what he belonged to, how many powers of darkness claimed him for their own. That was the reflection that made you creepy all over. It was impossible. It was not good for one either, trying to imagine. He had taken a high seat amongst the devils of the land. Literally. You can't understand. How could you? With solid pavement under your feet, surrounded by kind neighbors ready to cheer you or to fall on you, stepping delicately between the butcher and the policeman, in the holy terror of scandal and gallows and lunatic asylums, how can you imagine what particular region of the first ages a man's untrammeled feet may take him into by the way of solitude? Utter solitude without a policeman, by the way of silence, utter silence, where no warning voice of a kind neighbor can be heard whispering of public opinion. These little things make all the great difference. When they are gone, you must fall back upon your own innate strength, upon your own capacity for faithfulness. Of course, you may be too much of a fool to go wrong, too dull even to know you are being assaulted by the powers of darkness. I take it, no fool ever made a bargain for his soul with the devil. The fool is too much of a fool, or the devil is too much of a devil. I don't know which. Or you may be such a thunderingly exalted creature as to be altogether deaf and blind to anything but heavenly sights and sounds. Then the earth for you is only a standing place, and whether to be like this is your loss or your gain, I won't pretend to say. But most of us are neither one nor the other. The earth for us is a place to live in, where we must put up with sights, with sounds, with smells too, by Jove. Breathe dead hippo, so to speak, and not be contaminated. And there, don't you see? Your strength comes in, the faith in your ability for the digging of unostentatious holes to bury the stuff in, your power of devotion, not to yourself, but to an obscure, back-breaking business. And that's difficult enough. Mind, I'm not trying to excuse or even explain. I'm trying to account to myself for Mr. Kurtz, for the shade of Mr. Kurtz. This initiated wraith from the back of nowhere honored me with its amazing confidence before it vanished altogether. This was because it could speak English to me. The original Kurtz had been educated partly in England, and as he was good enough to say himself, his sympathies were in the right place. His mother was half English, his father was half French. All Europe contributed to the making of Kurtz. He begins to remark how little Kurtz really manifested to him. He was little more than a voice in the back of Marlow's head. But then on the mention of a girl, something changes. His tone shifts. He goes on and on about the might of Kurtz. There at the end, he says all of Europe created him. He brought more ivory than they knew what to do with, and everything in the jungle, everything he wanted to be his, was his. And all of this is in reference to protecting the girl, to protecting the world that women are within, as he said earlier regarding his aunt. He argues that for these powers, Kurtz had to make a deal with the devil, or some kind of devils out there. Again, giving Kurtz this supernatural aspect. Remarking that for people like Kurtz to exist, people who have pavements, policemen, lunatic asylums, they couldn't understand. All that matters in these places is one's own strength and faithfulness, something that he touts Kurtz as having to an inhuman degree. At this point, Marlow gets a little carried away in his narrative and begins to speak of things that haven't happened yet. Eventually, Marlow will meet Mr. Kurtz, as we'll see. But while at Kurtz's station, Marlow comes across a report that Kurtz had written. He was entrusted by a group called the International Society for the Suppression of Savage Customs. A fictional society within this book, but one going off the name, was probably intended to push this altruism in the midst of the African colonialism, or European colonialism in Africa. You get what I mean. Marlow says it was 17 pages that were very eloquently written and well put together. But then of this writing, Marlow says this. He began with the argument that we whites, from the point of development we have arrived at, must necessarily appear to them, savages, in the nature of supernatural beings. We approach them with the might of a deity, and so on and so on. By the simple exercise of our will, we can exert a power for good practically unbounded, etc., etc. It seems here that when Kurtz wrote this report, he was a mirror of the idealized view Europeans had of colonialism in Africa. We have so much power and advancement, we must come to them like gods. So let's use our godhood for good, and not other things. Again, at first, Kurtz was an agent of the company and Europe through and through. However, after 17 well-worded pages describing how we need to use our mighty power to help the locals, sometime later, at the very end, Kurtz had scrawled in an unsteady hand, "Exterminate all the brutes." It seems that whatever feelings of goodness or heroism Kurtz previously had vanished. Now his outlook on the world was vicious and violent. Back to where we left off after the helmsman's death and after Marlow got rid of his shoes, Marlow recounts of how he missed the helmsman. While commenting on the helmsman, Marlow says, "Well, don't you see? He had done something. He had steered. For months I had him at my back. A help, an instrument. It was a kind of partnership. He steered for me, I had to look after him. I worried about his deficiencies, and thus a subtle bond had been created, of which I only became aware when it was suddenly broken. And the intimate profundity of that look he gave me when he received his hurt remains to this day in my memory, like a claim of distant kinship, affirmed in a supreme moment. Poor fool! If only he had left the shutter alone! He had no restraint, just like Kurtz, a tree swayed by the wind." Drawing a connection between the helmsman and Kurtz is interesting. From what we just heard about Kurtz writing to exterminate all the brutes, it seems Marlow is drawing a lack of strength between the two. The helmsman was afraid of being attacked, so he threw open the shutter doors and was hit by a spear. His fear got the best of him and he wasn't able to restrain it. Just as hate or maliciousness that was within Kurtz caused him to override all his previous writing of goodness and the greatness of colonialism, and instead the only thing left is violence, to exterminate. This is paired in juxtaposition to the cannibal leader and the general manager, two figures who Marlow previously pointed out as showing restraint. It's an unlikely pairing and an unlikely show of respect and a lack of respect to four characters within the story. Some part of Marlow is starting to see men for who they are and who they act as rather than who they claim to be. With the helmsman being dead, Marlow hears some talk that some of the people on board would eat him. So Marlow pushes the helmsman's body over the boat, saying if anyone's to eat him, it might as well be the fish. To compound on this new thought process, Kurtz begins to admonish the pilgrims aboard, as the one in pajamas at the steering wheel begins to remark of what a good job they did. The red-haired pilgrim was beside himself with the thought that at least this poor Kurtz had been properly avenged. "Say, we must have made a glorious slaughter of them in the bush, huh? What do you think, say?" He positively danced, the bloodthirsty little gingery beggar, and he had nearly fainted when he saw the wounded man. I could not help saying, "You made a glorious lot of smoke anyhow." I had seen from the way the tops of the bushes rustled and flew that almost all the shots had gone too high. You can't hit anything unless you take aim and fire from the shoulder, but these chaps fired from the hip with their eyes shut. The retreat, I maintained, and I was right, was caused by the screeching of the steam whistle. Upon this, they forgot Kurtz and began to howl at me with indignant protests, again further emphasizing the lack of capability of these guys in the jungle. Guys used to pavement under their feet and policemen, as Kurtz would say. They turn the corner in the river, and sure enough, finally, they find Kurtz's station. The building there has been long dilapidated. Grass overgrows it, there's holes in the roof, and outside of the building is what appears to be poles with circles on top of them. And in the tree line around the building, he can see multiple people working their way through the jungle. Oddly, in the midst of them, there's a white man standing on the dock, waving them in, telling them to come to shore. The manager yells that they've been attacked, and the man on shore says he knows and that it's all right. Marlow remarks as they get close how strange this white man on the dock is. He's clean-shaven, has pale skin, and blue eyes. He goes from these extreme, excitable bursts of energy to very quiet and depressed without incident. Looking at his clothes, Marlow says that his clothes are made up of a bunch of patchworks. Different pieces of different brightly colored material stitched here and there from stuff he could salvage. Because of this whole appearance, Marlow remarks that he looks like a harlequin. A harlequin is a known character type from Italian theater. They wore bright costumes, they would make jokes, and they were seen as a sort of witty servant for a king or lord. Think similar to a court jester. The harlequin's appearance further gives in to the insanity of this place. You have Kurtz, who is hailed and bestowed as a king, and he has his own servant who's dressed as a harlequin who comes out to meet them. And on top of that, he kind of acts like one. The pilgrims and the general manager go up to Kurtz's station, while the harlequin boards the ship with Marlow, who's staying to watch it. The harlequin assures Marlow that the natives mean no harm, and in the same breath that it took him some time to get them to stop. Marlow says, "I thought you said they meant no harm," and the harlequin's like, "Well, they didn't exactly mean any harm." Marlow asks if the harlequin talks with Mr. Kurtz, and the harlequin says, "You don't talk with Mr. Kurtz, you listen to him." He then springs into an eager tale of his story. He explains that he was a runaway from a young age and spent time on English and Russian boats. Eventually, he made his way to the Congo and met Mr. Kurtz, deciding to stay. He then says the old house they stopped at that had the sign telling them to hurry up with the firewood was his. Marlow gives him his book back, and it turns out this code that was written on the side was just Russian, text that Marlow hadn't encountered before. Marlow asks if the natives are peaceful, then why did they attack? And the harlequin says it's because they don't want Mr. Kurtz to go. Marlow looks at this man, and his whole countenance strikes him with a sort of envy. Here's someone who's seen horrors Marlow likely couldn't imagine. Yet his whole countenance is joyous and boisterous. Perhaps the effects of a young mind that ran away and was exposed to this from a young age, or that's just the effect of Kurtz. There is something about his countenance, however, that makes Marlow cautious. I did not envy him his devotion to Kurtz, though. He had not meditated over it. It came to him, and he accepted it with a sort of eager fatalism. I must say that to me it appeared about the most dangerous thing in every way he had come upon so far. They had come together unavoidably, like two ships becalmed near each other and lay rubbing sides at last. I suppose Kurtz wanted an audience, because on a certain occasion they encamped in the forest. They had talked all night, or more probably, Kurtz had talked. "We talked of everything," he said, quite transported at the recollection. "I forgot there was such a thing as sleep. The night did not seem to last an hour. Everything. Of love, too." "Ah, he talked to you of love?" I said, much amused. "It isn't what you think," he cried almost passionately. "It was in general. He made me see things. Marlow's starting to suspect there's something malicious in Kurtz. He has this young boy who lives out here as his sort of disciple. Someone that idolizes him to a point of fatalism, as Marlow said. The harlequin goes on to say that recently, Kurtz had been quite sick. The harlequin had nursed him through a couple of pretty serious illnesses. In the midst of this, Kurtz periodically goes out into the jungle by himself, being gone for weeks at a time. He always comes back with different tribesmen and full of ivory. While speaking to the harlequin, Marlow learns that Kurtz regularly goes on raids across the countryside, using this group of natives he's put together to pillage the others. When Marlow seems bothered by this, the harlequin says that you can't judge Kurtz like a normal man. To make an example, the harlequin says at one point Kurtz threatened to shoot him. He says this is because the harlequin had a little bit of ivory that another chief gave him, and Kurtz demanded that that ivory be his, and the harlequin gave it over. As Marlow said earlier, anything Kurtz would want to be his becomes that. It's like the harlequin has an emotional dependency on Kurtz. He thinks if Kurtz is so great, he shudders to imagine what he would do without him. The harlequin said that recently Kurtz had been gone for a few months. He came back with new tribe members ready to wage another war. As the harlequin is saying this, Marlow is using his binoculars to look at the station. Remember those posts I said he saw earlier that seemed to have these weird orbs on top of them? Well, now looking at it through binoculars, Marlow sees that these are human heads on pikes. While speaking to the people on the boat that he's relaying this whole story to, Marlow says this: "I'm not disclosing any trade secrets. In fact, the manager said afterwards that Mr. Kurtz's methods had ruined the district. I have no opinion on that point. But I want you clearly to understand that there was nothing exactly profitable in these heads being there. They only showed that Mr. Kurtz lacked restraint in the gratification of his various lusts, that there was something wanting in him, some small matter which, when the pressing need arose, could not be found under his magnificent eloquence. Whether he knew of this deficiency himself, I can't say. I think that knowledge came to him at last, only at the very last. But the wilderness had found him out early, and had taken on him a terrible vengeance for the fantastic invasion. I think it had whispered to him things about himself which he did not know, things of which he had no conception till he took counsel with this great solitude, and the whisper had proved irresistibly fascinating. It echoed loudly within him because he was hollow at the core. Put down the glass, and the head that had appeared near enough to be spoken to seemed at once to have leaped away from me into inaccessible distance." Marlow is realizing that if Mr. Kurtz was once a great man, that man is no more. Mr. Kurtz may not even realize what he's become, but the wilderness has. Once again, Kurtz's lack of restraint is brought up. All the way at the beginning of his story, Marlow clarified that what separates us from monsters is our objective, our soul, our idea behind it all. But as he said, there's no progress made from heads on stakes. Whatever Kurtz was, he was now a man lost to his own obsession. The harlequin doesn't seem fazed by this. He continues on talking of all the amazing thing Kurtz has done, and begins to speak of how Kurtz holds these rituals. Rituals where the tribe leaders would crawl up to him. Rituals we hear in other parts of the story involve them sacrificing things to him, bringing him their offerings. In the opening lines of the report Kurtz wrote, he spoke as how we Europeans must seem godlike to these people of the continent. And it seems Kurtz has used that belief to frame himself as a tyrannical ruler. Marlow is disgusted and says he doesn't want to hear any more of this, and the harlequin seems shocked and clarifies, "Oh, those heads on stakes, those are the heads of rebels." Marlow laughs at this, yet another definition to justify slaughter. He had heard earlier in his journey that these people were enemies, that some of them were criminals, and that justified what was happening to them. And now these heads must surely be rebels of Kurtz's one-man war. At Marlow's disgust in this, the harlequin speaks out. "You don't know how such a life tries a man like Kurtz," cried Kurtz's last disciple. "Well, and you?" I said. I am a simple man. I have no great thoughts. I want nothing from anybody. How can you compare me to—" His feelings were too much for speech, and suddenly he broke down. "I don't understand," he groaned. "I've been doing my best to keep him alive, and that's enough. I had no hand in all this. I have no abilities. There hasn't been a drop of medicine or a mouthful of invalid food for months here. He was shamefully abandoned. A man like this with such ideas, shamefully. I haven't slept for the last 10 nights. It seems the harlequin was also a figure subdued by Kurtz, just in another way. At this time, it seems Mr. Kurtz is very sick. So the manager and the pilgrims are walking back to the ship, carrying a stretcher. As soon as they make their way out of the house, they are suddenly surrounded by the natives, all standing with weapons at the ready, awaiting Kurtz's order. The Russian whispers to Marlow and says, if he does not say the right thing to them, we're all done for. And then the man on the stretcher leans up, and for the first time, Marlow sees Mr. Kurtz. Let us hope that the man who can talk so well of love in general will find some particular reason to spare us this time, I said. I resented bitterly the absurd danger of our situation, as if to be at the mercy of that atrocious phantom had been a dishonoring necessity. I could not hear a sound. Through my glasses, I saw the thin arm extended commandingly, the lower jaw moving, the eyes of that apparition shining darkly far in its bony head that nodded with grotesque jerks. Kurtz, that means short in German, don't it? Well, the name was as true as everything else in his life and death. He looked at least 7 feet long. His covering had fallen off, and his body emerged from it pitiful and appalling as from a winding sheet. I could see the cage of his ribs all astir, the bones of his arms waving. It was as though an animated image of death carved out of old ivory had been shaking its hand with menaces at a motionless crowd of men made of dark and glittering bronze. I saw him open his mouth wide. It gave him a weirdly voracious aspect, as though he had wanted to swallow all the air, all the earth, all the men before him. A deep voice reached me faintly. He must have been shouting. He fell back suddenly. The stretcher shook as the bearers staggered forward again, and almost at the same time I noticed that the crowd of savages was vanishing without any perceptible movement of retreat, as if the force that had ejected these beings so suddenly had drawn them in again as the breath is drawn in a long aspiration. Whatever Kurtz was, he's just a carcass of it now. Sure, he's tall, he can see the command that other people listen to him with, he can hear his booming voice, but everything else about him is skin and bones. This land has taken as much of a toll on him as he has on it. But whatever he said, it wasn't a war cry. The natives descend back into the jungle, and Mr. Kurtz allows himself to be brought on board. As Kurtz is laying on the boat, he's reading letters that the company was supposed to deliver to him. Letters from the previous year that he's been AWOL. One of the letters seems to be about Marlow, again one of the recommendations that his aunt put together. Kurtz reads the letter, looks at Marlow, and says, "I'm glad." The first interaction the two have with each other, and for the first time, Marlow puts a voice to this idea. One that is strong given his current state, but still an echo of what used to be, or at least as far as Marlow knows, what surely had to be used to be. That night, several of the natives have begun to sit around the shore near the boat. Amongst them, a beautiful woman steps out, covered in ivory and jewels. She comes near the boat, wails in a sort of mourning, and then continues on. It's never said explicitly, but I believe this to be Kurtz's wife, or at least the wife he took for himself out here in the jungle. After she leaves, the harlequin remarks that if she came on board, he probably would have tried to shoot her. He says that recently she had become more and more persistent, and it seems the harlequin began to worry about his own safety, but remarks that it's over now. To which at this, Kurtz begins to speak. At this moment, I heard Kurtz's deep voice behind the curtain. "Save me. Save the ivory, you mean? Don't tell me, save me. Why, I've had to save you. You are interrupting my plans now. Sick. Not so sick as you would like to believe. Never mind. I'll carry my ideas out yet. I will return. I'll show you what can be done. You with your little peddling notions. You are interfering with me. I will return. And then his voice trails off. The harlequin, like everyone else, had all this talk of the wisdom of Kurtz and how knowledgeable and gracious he is. But all we see is an angry warlord. Someone who's upset that he's ill because there's more world to take and more people to slaughter. Kurtz's reputation is being betrayed by Kurtz himself. The manager pulls Marlow to the side and says that clearly Kurtz has done more harm than good for the company. He remarks that they need to save the ivory that's already gathered here, but they're not going to be able to hunt this area for some time. They need to let the evidence of Kurtz go away. Marlow agrees with this and says that now it seems Kurtz has been acting completely on his own without any order or regard for others. And then the manager says that he agrees and it's time to notify the proper people at the company. At which point Marlow flips on his conversation with the manager and says that he believes Kurtz to be a remarkable man regardless. The manager seems surprised by this remark and says he was, and then walks away. As Marlow puts it, it was something to have at least a choice of nightmares. Marlow clearly does not agree with what Kurtz is doing. He's disgusted by it, if anything. But what he's even more disgusting with is everything he's seen out of the company up until this point. An orderly manufacturing of suffering for money. A system that shows no signs of going away soon. If he's to compare his nightmares, as Marlow describes it, he'll take the guy who he at least thought something of at some point. If they're both vicious rulers, at least Kurtz comes about it honestly. After his conversation with the manager, the harlequin pulls Marlow to the side and says that he suspects, accurately, that the management has some ill will towards Kurtz. Because yes, it would be a lot better for the company if Kurtz and everything he did down here disappeared. It was going to look bad if Kurtz was killed by natives. It looks even worse if this guy the company revered so much was doing the killing himself, and a lot of it, and putting their heads on sticks and whatnot. Also, earlier, the manager said that if someone else is trading ivory in this region, they'll just hang them. And it turns out that person trading ivory was the aforementioned ivory that the harlequin had got from a tribe leader. So Marlow tells the harlequin that he needs to get out of here or the company's probably going to kill him. The harlequin says in that case he's going to slip away into the jungle and go to one of the tribes that he is friends with. But before he goes, he wants to make sure that Marlow will preserve Kurtz's memory. See, the harlequin thinks the world of Kurtz, and he's convinced that, as will probably happen, the company's just going to bury his history. So he asks Marlow to assure him that Marlow at least will carry on his memory. Marlow, likely out of a disdain for the company more than anything, says Mr. Kurtz's reputation is safe with me. The harlequin rambles for a bit. He confirms that the attack they had that killed the helmsman was ordered by Kurtz because Kurtz didn't want to be taken away. But nevertheless, Kurtz was an amazing man, and that should be remembered. So the harlequin says goodbye and takes off into the night. That night, Marlow wakes up sometime after midnight. He looks to the shore and sees that there's a large pyre burning, and around it, through the woods, smaller fires. There's drums beating and singing. It seems some sort of ritual is taking place. And Marlow looks over to see that Kurtz is gone. Marlow feels conflicted. On the one hand, he wants to raise the alarm and have Mr. Kurtz stopped, but that would likely kill him, and for some reason, that seems like sacrilege. Maybe just because he had told the harlequin that he would preserve Kurtz's memory, and there seems something wrong in ordering something that would cause his execution. Marlow thinks to himself that Kurtz is sick and probably crawling up the bank, if anything, so Marlow will go get him himself. When he jumps ashore, Marlow says this: I fancy I had some vague notion of falling upon him and giving him a drubbing. I don't know. I had some imbecile thoughts. The knitting old woman with the cat obtruded herself upon my memory as a most improper person to be sitting at the other end of such an affair. I just like that line. We're near the end of the story and it places such a bookend on it. He's now standing on the shore at night around fires and drumming, looking for Kurtz crawling around on the ground, a man who previously he revered even though he never met. And all of this started with an old woman knitting with a cat on her lap. While working his way through the darkness of the jungle, he sees Kurtz, his white form, crawling through the grass. He comes up to Kurtz, but as he gets close, Kurtz hears him. Kurtz stands up, a weak but towering figure, and Marlow realizes the position he's in. There are fires everywhere, people chanting all around. All Kurtz has to do is yell, and Marlow's dead. But instead, all Kurtz says is, "Go away, hide yourself." Marlow asks if he knows what he's doing, and Kurtz says, "Perfectly." Then standing there quietly amidst fires, Marlow says this: "You will be lost," I said, "utterly lost." One gets sometimes such a flash of inspiration, you know. I did say the right thing, though indeed he could not have been more irretrievably lost than he was at this very moment, when the foundations of our intimacy were being laid to endure, even to the end, even beyond. I had immense plans, he muttered irresolutely. "Yes," said I, "but if you try to shout, I'll smash your head with—" There was not a stick or a stone near. "I'll throttle you for good," I corrected myself. "I was on the threshold of great things," he pleaded, in a voice of longing, with a wistfulness of tone that made my blood run cold. "And now for this stupid scoundrel. Your success in Europe is assured in any case," I affirmed steadily. I did not want to have the throttling of him, you understand, and indeed it would have been very little use for any practical purpose. I tried to break the spell, the heavy, mute spell of the wilderness that seemed to draw him to its pitiless breast by the awakening of forgotten and brutal instincts, by the memory of gratified and monstrous passions. This alone, I was convinced, had driven him out to the edge of the forest, to the bush, towards the gleam of fires, the throb of drums, the drone of weird incantations. This alone had beguiled his unlawful soul beyond the bounds of permitted aspirations. And, don't you see, the terror of the position was not in being knocked on the head, though I had a very lively sense of that danger too, but in this, that I had to deal with a being to whom I could not appeal in the name of anything high or low. Marlow goes on to say that Kurtz is someone who has kicked himself loose of the earth. All of his passions, whatever those may be, are out there in the jungle somewhere. It's something that Marlow can't appeal to. He can't convince him to come back on the boat. Except for that one line he said at the beginning, by saying Kurtz will be completely lost. This is the final step to step away from any sense of recognition or greatness. But Kurtz seems convinced he was on the verge of something, that there was some greatness out there. Marlow clarifies that his reputation in Europe will be secure. After all, Marlow promised. Marlow says this was someone who couldn't be reasoned with. This was clearly a brilliant man who knew many things. He had a brilliant mind, but his soul had gone mad. But despite this, Marlow's final plea somehow works. Perhaps Kurtz just recognized he was at the end of the line. So Kurtz goes back to the ship with Marlow, and the next day they leave at noon. As they drive away, it seems 1,000 of the natives are standing on the shore. The woman from the night before breaks through the line and goes out wading into the river, crying, reaching out for them. And as she cries, those behind her cry with her. As with the harlequin and the heads on pikes, these were more people who were victims of Kurtz's control. As they cry out, Marlow looks at Kurtz and says, "Do you understand this?" Kurtz replies, "Do I not?" Marlow sees several of the pilgrims pull out their rifles, and wanting to prevent any more bloodshed, Marlow pulls the whistle, causing the natives on shore to run away. The pilgrims, behaving as imbeciles, as Marlow describes, fire their guns anyway, and once again the whole ship is filled with smoke. They had no interest with what was happening out here, with interacting with this other part of humanity that was too different from their own. And so from here, as Marlow said, the brown current ran swiftly out of the heart of darkness, taking them back to the coast of Africa. On their travel, Kurtz speaks to Marlow every now and then. He's feeble and his thoughts sometimes wander, but Marlow hears the eloquence that others have spoken of. He would say things like "my intended," referring to someone he intended to marry back home, "my station, my career, my ideas." As Marlow phrases it, the shade of the original Kurtz frequented the bedside of the hollow sham. He would speak of meeting kings, of these grand plans, how important it is to have right motives and let others recognize your abilities. Kurtz was lying on a couch in the same house as the steering wheel. One day, he abruptly said, "Close the shutter," asking Marlow to close the shutter that allows him to see the jungle. After Marlow does, Kurtz says, "Oh, but I will wring your heart yet," as if still at war with something beyond the trees. Kurtz gives Marlow a stack of his personal belongings, assuming the general manager may peer through it if Kurtz is unable to stop him. Even in his sleep, Kurtz would mutter things, saying, "Live rightly, die, die." He planned to write for the papers again, saying that it's his duty given all the things he's seen. Marlow looks at Kurtz and describes him as an impenetrable darkness. Something wicked, something sad, but definitely something that cannot be understood. One evening, Marlow comes into the room that Kurtz is lying in, and Kurtz says, "I am lying here in the dark, waiting for death." Marlow at first thinks this nonsense, but then notices something. Anything approaching the change that came over his features I have never seen before, and hope never to see again. Oh, I wasn't touched. I was fascinated. It was as though a veil had been rent. I saw on that ivory face the expression of somber pride, of ruthless power, of craven terror, of an intense and hopeless despair. Did he live his life again in every detail of desire, temptation, and surrender during that supreme moment of complete knowledge? He cried in a whisper at some image, at some vision. He cried out twice, a cry that was no more than a breath. The horror. The horror. I blew the candle out and left the cabin. Moments later, someone goes into the cabin and says that Mr. Kurtz is dead. He was a man who in his final moments was wholly discontented with the state of his life. Sure, he had lived by his own desires and his lack of restraint, as Marlow put it, but when he was waiting for death, he was far from satisfied, thinking of all the things he should have done, all the things he could have done, his ideas, his ivory, his station. All of it amounted to nothing, and then in his final words, we get the most debated part of the entire book. What did Kurtz mean by the horror? Was this simply him speaking of death, of the death or afterlife that awaited him? Was this him looking back at his own life, looking at the things he had done and having this moment of clarity, realizing the horror that he had caused? Or was this horror the summary of the world around him, one that he thought he had to become monstrous to stand against? There is no solid answer, but I have my own ideas that I'll talk about later. Here, Kurtz dies and he's buried in a hole on the side of the Congo. And now that just leaves Marlow, the man who promised to take on his memory. Marlow stands by what he said. He does think that Kurtz is a remarkable man. He had something to say, and he sure said it. He said that his eyes were staring enough to penetrate all the hearts that beat in the darkness. It's as if to Marlow, Kurtz was no longer a man, but he was an idea, a summarization of those who let the earth take the best of them. Ones who act without restraint, ones who left an idea become their personhood. But all that amounted to was a body dead on the side of the Congo. So now Marlow, someone who previously admired Kurtz and more so admired the concept of Kurtz, has to decide what kind of memory he will allow Kurtz to have. From here, Marlow made it out of the Congo and eventually returned back to England, although while there, he was never satisfied. He says, "I found myself back in that sepulchral city, resenting the sight of people hurrying through the streets to filch a little money from each other, to devour their infamous cookery, to gulp their unwholesome beer, to dream their insignificant and silly dreams. They trespassed upon my thoughts. They were intruders whose knowledge of life was to me an irritating pretense, because I felt so sure they could not possibly know the things I knew. Their bearing, which was simply the bearing of commonplace individuals going about their business in the assurance of perfect safety, was offense to me like the outrageous flauntings of folly in the face of a danger it is unable to comprehend. I had no particular desire to enlighten them, but I had some difficulty in restraining myself from laughing in their faces, so full of stupid importance. I dare say I was not very well at this time." Marlow had seen something he was not able to come to terms with. The life he saw in the Congo seemed to override any pleasantries he saw back home, and he saw much of society's concerns as childish. Marlow keeps the papers that Kurtz had given him. Eventually, someone from the company comes trying to claim those papers, and Marlow refuses. The person from the company gets mad and says it's the company's right to know of anything involving the territories Mr. Kurtz was in. Of course, in reality, the company just wants to make sure that these reports never get out, that no one knows the company's top guy was capable of all this. Marlow assures him that Mr. Kurtz's writings has nothing to do with commerce or administration. So to satiate the man, he gives him Kurtz's 17-page report on the suppression of savage customs, of course, with the final page ripped off. The page that said to exterminate all the brutes. Earlier, Marlow had said that he had chosen his nightmare. If it was between the company or Kurtz, he was going to go with the guy who at least shows himself for what he is. So in some regard, this move of removing the last page can be seen more so as a middle finger to the company rather than a commitment to the betterment of Kurtz's memory. But regardless, he's still protecting Kurtz's memory in some way, even if it's just to not give the company a way to discredit him. Shortly after this, Kurtz's cousin arrives. He wants to hear all about Kurtz's final moments in the Congo. The cousin remarks that on top of everything else we know about Kurtz, Kurtz was also a great musician. Not even Kurtz's cousin can nail down exactly what Kurtz was. He was a businessman, he was a painter, he was a journalist, he was a writer, he was a musician. So the two talk. Marlow gives this cousin several of Kurtz's letters and he leaves. Then someone else turns up, a journalist who Kurtz had known. This journalist said that Kurtz's real calling was that of a politician. He says he never thought of Kurtz as a great writer, but the man was an incredible speaker. He could get someone to believe anything, and he would have been fit as the leader of an extreme party. When Marlow asks which one, the colleague says, "I don't know, an extreme one." He gives this journalist another copy of Kurtz's report on savage customs, again with the final page removed, and leaves it to him if it should be published or not. The only thing that's left is a series of personal letters and a picture of Kurtz's intended, or as we would call her today, his fiancée. Marlow thinks it best to go to Kurtz's fiancée and give her these final possessions. Marlow remarking that in a way this was to save himself, to finally remove this burden that Kurtz had placed on him, or the idea of Kurtz and the fact that he was now the torchbearer of his memory had placed on him. He mulls over Kurtz again, calling him the heart of a conquering darkness. While thinking on these things and how Kurtz's memory should live on, he remembers something Kurtz told him on the boat. He said one day, "This lot of ivory now is really mine. The company did not pay for it. I collected it myself at a very great personal risk. I'm afraid they will try to claim it as theirs, though. It is a difficult case. What do you think I ought to do? Resist? Huh?" He wanted no more than justice. No more than justice. This idea that Kurtz wanted justice weighs heavy on Marlow, because what does justice look like? Kurtz is dead. Any wrongdoing he's done cannot be paid back as justice. And to either uphold or destroy Kurtz's reputation, would that be justice to Marlow, justice to the universe? Would it be justice to hurt those who knew him? These are all things he asks himself as he goes to meet the fiancée. As he arrives at her house, the fiancée steps out in black clothes. She's in a state of mourning, and her dress seems reminiscent to the women at the beginning of this journey. The women who Marlow expected to be grieving men who would never return home, and now he stands before a fiancée grieving one who has never returned home. Marlow remarks at this point it had been over a year since she found out Kurtz was dead, but nevertheless she's in mourning, a mourning that Marlow thinks will continue forever. He remarks that she had a mature capacity for fidelity, for belief, for suffering. This should be familiar because it's in contrast with what Marlow said earlier in the story, that women need to be protected. He's establishing here that if anyone can take the truth, it might be her. He remarks that she was one of the creatures who was not a plaything of time. For her, he had died only yesterday. He says in that moment it seems time faded for him as well. That while he was standing here watching her mourn, he in the same moment was back on the boat watching Kurtz die. It's as if all the emotions were made new again. She asks if Marlow knew him well, and Marlow says he did. She asked if he admired him before remarking that it would be impossible for someone to not admire him. To which Marlow repeats his rehearsed line again, he was a remarkable man. Before in grief, the fiancée quickly shouts that she knew him better than anyone. She knew him best. But there seems to be a desperation to her tone, a desperation for her to believe that she did know him best, that she was the one closer to Kurtz than anyone else, that everyone loved him, but she was special. Marlow remarks, with every word spoken, the room was growing darker, and only her forehead, smooth and white, remained illuminated by the inextinguishable light of belief and love. She remarks, "You were his friend," she went on. "His friend. His friend," she repeated a little louder. "You must have been. If he had given you this and sent you to me, I feel I can speak to you, and oh, I must speak. I want you who have heard his last words, to know I have been worthy of him. It is not pride. Yes, I am proud to know I understood him better than anyone on earth. He told me so himself. And since his mother died, I've had no one to... I listened. The darkness deepened. I was not even sure whether he had given me the right bundle. I rather suspect he wanted me to take care of another batch of his papers, which, after his death, I saw the manager examining under the lamp. And the girl talked, easing her pain in the certitude of my sympathy. She talked as thirsty men drink. I had heard that her engagement with Kurtz had been disapproved by her people. He wasn't rich enough or something. And indeed, I don't know whether he had not been a pauper all his life. He had given me some reason to infer that it was his impatience of comparative poverty that drove him out there. Who was not his friend who had heard him speak once, she was saying. He drew men towards him by what was best in them. She looked at me with intensity. It is the gift of the great, she went on, and the sound of her low voice seemed to have the accompaniment of all the other sounds, full of mystery, desolation, and sorrow, I had ever heard. The ripple of the river, the soughing of the trees swayed by the wind, the murmurs of the crowds, the faint ring of incomprehensible words cried from afar, the whisper of a voice speaking from beyond the threshold of an eternal darkness. "But you have heard him, you know," she cried. "Yes, I know," I said with something like despair in my heart, but bowing my head before the faith that was in her, before that great and saving illusion that shone with an unearthly glow in the darkness, in the triumphant darkness from which I could not have defended her, from which I could not even defend myself. I like to mention that her voice has the accompaniment of all the other sounds. The same things he had seen on the journey, the truths, the desperations. As he remarked earlier, all of humanity, regardless of where you are, can be boiled down to the same base emotions. And here was sorrow, earnestness. He refers to Kurtz's image as an illusion in the darkness, a darkness that he can't save her from and can't even save himself from. She continues, remarking what a loss Kurtz had been to the world. She said she was fortunate with him for a little while, but now that he's gone, she'll be unhappy for life. When Marlow remarks that they'll remember him, she stops him and says no, that it's impossible to remember someone who was so many things, someone who had so many great plans and ideas that are now utterly wasted. Marlow seems uncomfortable by this. She remarks that he will be an example to many men, and Marlow says, his example too, yes, his example, I forgot that. She puts her arms out, remarking that she'll never see him again, and in that moment, Marlow is reminded of the woman he saw by the river. Two women across continents who both grieved the loss of Kurtz, both completely unaware of the other. The fiancée quietly remarks to herself that he died as he lived, which is something truer than she could know. Marlow remarks that his death was fitting of his life, again a very true statement, if not meant that way in the conversation, and she remarks that she should have been there, that she would have cherished every breath, every word, before asking Marlow if he was there in his final moments. For Marlow clarifies that he did hear his last words. And then the book ends on these lines. "Repeat them," she murmured in a heartbroken tone. I want something to live with." I was on the point of crying at her. "Don't you hear them?" The dusk was repeating them in a persistent whisper all around us, in a whisper that seemed to swell menacingly like the first whisper of a rising wind. The horror. "His last word, to live with," she insisted. "Don't you understand? I loved him. I pulled myself together and spoke slowly. "The last word he pronounced was your name." I heard a light sigh, and then my heart stood still. stopped dead short by an exulting and terrible cry, by the cry of inconceivable triumph and of unspeakable pain. I knew it! I was sure! She knew. She was sure. I heard her weeping. She had hidden her face in her hands. It seemed to me that the house would collapse before I could escape, that the heavens would fall upon my head, but nothing happened. The heavens do not fall for such a trifle. Would they have fallen, I wonder, if I had rendered Kurtz that justice which was his due? Hadn't he said he wanted only justice? But I couldn't. I could not tell her. It would have been too dark altogether. Marlow ceased and sat apart, indistinct and silent, in the pose of a meditating Buddha. Nobody moved for a time. We've lost the first of the ebb, said the director suddenly. I raised my head. The offing was barred by a black bank of clouds, and the tranquil waterway leading to the uttermost ends of the earth flowed somber under an overcast sky, seemed to lead into the heart of an immense darkness. So in the end, Marlow lies to the fiancé, and a lot of stuff we read in the book up until this point now makes sense. There were a couple times randomly in the story that Marlow broke and talked about the sanctity of women, that they must be protected, they must be preserved, and it kind of comes out of left field then, but it makes sense now because this entire story he's telling is contextualized by his lie to Kurtz's fiancé. He also remarked earlier in the story how much he detests lies. He hates them, they betray truth, they're antithetical to humanity. So then why in this final moment does he lie? Well, the surface answer is to protect the woman, right? She was so convinced, and she wanted to be convinced, that Kurtz loved her more than anyone else. Something that we know to not be the case, at least not in any way that matters. Aside from the obvious example of Kurtz taking for him a wife in the jungle, he also abandoned his entire life with his fiancée to act as a warlord in the Congo. She's desperate to know that she mattered to Kurtz more than anyone else, but that's just not the case. It seems throughout his life that Kurtz was searching for something, and everyone kind of saw glimpses of that. For the fiancé, it was the love. For the colleague, it was politics. To the cousin, it was a musician. Even the harlequin, who was presented by Kurtz's true nature, rejected it. He saw him as a wise leader rather than the tyrant he was. The only one who truly saw Kurtz, saw every part of Kurtz, seemed to be Marlow. I mean, sure, people like the general manager saw the bad that Kurtz had done and objectively came to the conclusion that it needed to be stopped, but it doesn't seem the general manager considered all of the ends that Marlow had, what it would take for a man to fully abandon his position and go on his own. Marlow saw all the romanticism of Kurtz and also all the evil, and it seems in the end Marlow decided that despite his remarkability, it cannot justify the horrors he's done, the head-on pikes, the wars, the rituals, but nevertheless, he bears the memory. With that knowledge, the lie to the fiancé is more complicated, and it shows as it's clearly something that weighs on him. If Marlow is to bear the memory, and in those moments speaking to Kurtz, he decided to carry on whatever wish he had for life, well, the wish Kurtz claimed to have wanted is justice. Justice is, of course, synonymous with the truth or knowing the truth. Well, justice for the memory of Kurtz would be to show the truth, to give the company man the final page of the document that said exterminate all the brutes. To tell the fiancé that he actually had this surreal horror in the end, that he saw something awful and did not go peacefully, that he's not deserving of her grief and is not worth the suffering she's in now. But of course, even if he was to say those things, she wouldn't believe him. And also, as Marlow's made reference to earlier, perhaps there was some grand Kurtz before all of this. Perhaps there was some man worthy of wisdom, of character, who spoke eloquently, who was a politician, a painter, and a musician. Maybe she, who had known that Kurtz, would never believe what had become of him in the Congo. So he tells her a lie, that in his final moments, Kurtz thought of her. Marlow's final words of the story are interesting when he says telling her the truth would have been too dark altogether. As mentioned, the word dark, including the title, has shown up a lot through the story. It goes initially from describing the jungle to describing the condition of Kurtz. And now he says here that telling her the truth would have been too dark. Because of this, the lie is twofold. It's for one, a lie of the truth regarding Kurtz in order to make the fiancé feel better, to feel justified in her love of Kurtz. But if throughout the story we've seen darkness, as Marlow describes it at one point, humanity without the cloak of time, then perhaps here Marlow is also rejecting the human concept of justice, of truth. He's sticking with the narrative that's more appealing, one that people want to hear. And with that, there's almost a rejection of some of the influences Marlow's had throughout the story. From the way the Africans behaved to the way the people at the company behaved, he saw several examples of how people followed their principles and expressed their desires. But at the base of it all is some truth, some idea. Well, here in the end, Marlow allows the idea of Kurtz to exist even if it's not the reality of Kurtz. or at the very least, the fiance's idea of Kurtz. It once again goes back to what Marlow said at the beginning of this story. There has to be an idea, a concept at the back of it all, otherwise we're just monsters. So perhaps in allowing the idea of Kurtz to exist, everything Kurtz did meant something. Everything Marlow went through meant something. But in the end, it is the desire to go towards something comforting rather than something that's honest. Immediately after, we get the closing of our framing device. The group of people sitting on the boat listening to an older Marlow tell this tale. At the beginning of this story, the unnamed narrator spoke of all of the greatness that had come out of the Thames, thinking of Captain Franklin and all these people that had come from the biggest and best city on earth. But in the final lines of the story, the narrator now looks up the Thames into England and says it seemed to lead into the heart of an immense darkness. This is the exact same verbiage that was used to describe the Congo. But now the narrator seems that it wasn't the heart of the Congo at all. This darkness isn't some boogeyman in some far-off land we can hunt down and capture to chain in its monstrosity, as Marlow said, speaking of the jungle. It is instead something that is bred and festered in everyone, and something that's proven by the life of Kurtz. The mind of man is capable of anything, as Marlow said. When you look at the story as a whole, there's several different themes at play. The most upfront theme is, of course, colonialism, and specifically, its hypocrisy. Marlow goes down there with all the ideas of civilization, of bettering the people of Africa, only to see that has resulted in death and greed. There's a couple of ethical notes from the book that I think are important to point out. The most self-evident one, as you've probably noticed, is that of racism and superiority. Now, to get it out of the way, the depiction of something does not mean the condoning of it. If you make a movie or a book about slavery or racism, the work of art itself is not inherently racist. Most writers will have characters do or say things they don't agree with for the purpose of the plot or the theme or the message. I emphasize that now to say I don't think there's any underlying issues in the writing that come from Marlow's verbiage or Joseph Conrad's writing of Marlow's behavior. It's a story set in colonial Africa in the 1890s. To portray that setting and not have the language be harsh and not have travesties performed would be incredulous. More so, the criticism I've heard of Heart of Darkness that carries more of a weight to me is the way the Africans are used as plot elements within the story. There are instances through Marlow's journey that he begins to build up the humanity of the Africans, or more specifically, that their humanity isn't so far removed from his own. Clearly, the wrongdoing that is done to them at the company and in Kurtz Wars is portrayed as a bad thing. Which, yes, they shouldn't be murdered. Great start. But as Marlow describes his connections to the Africans he sees, which is Joseph Conrad's point to insert his subtext or his messages into the story, it's never a meeting of the two at some point in humanity. It's instead the Europeans, or Marlow, returning to a base. While obviously these Africans wouldn't have been as technologically advanced or as literate as Marlow, that's not what the story's describing here. It's describing something deeper, some expressing of emotion. And as Kurtz's true nature becomes more apparent through the book, Marlow relates it to the savagery around him. The ultimate resolution of the book being it's not necessarily a savagery that was induced by the Congo, but is instead the darkness within the heart of every man. So it's not him necessarily saying Africa just does that to people, but at the same time, that falls back into further criticism. The language around Kurtz and the natives frame it as some evil that they've all fallen into. You could say this just applies to some of the natives that are depicted as doing things we would all agree are wrong, like cannibalism. But as far as the writing goes, there's not really a distinction between the two. I mean, if anything, the cannibal gets one of the more favorable treatments in the book. Even when the Africans are described as favorable, there's a lot of objectivity used. Sure, it makes sense in instances like the workers that are dying by the shore early in the book. The descriptions of a mass of black bodies are meant to contribute to the dehumanization of the scene, but later in the story, when aboard the steamboat, the boiler and the helmsman are described as cogs in a machine. When the helmsman dies, sure, Marlow feels something akin to sympathy, but it's described as sympathy one would have for a device or an animal. I point out all of this to say I don't think the novel is as progressive as some people claim it to be. There's two trains of thought when people discuss this novel. Either Joseph Conrad was way ahead of his time and was just using language that was familiar to Europeans in 1899, and through that language was able to break through and show people that we're not so different after all. And the other train of thought is that Conrad was completely dehumanizing of the Africans, thought of them as animals, and alluded to the idea that any soulful connection between Europeans to that of Africans should be seen as bad. Where it seems to me the truth is somewhere more in the middle. I think Conrad made some astute points, especially for the time, in connecting humanity to what he witnessed and initially thought as against humanity, recognizing things like restraint and character and emotions expressed in ways he had never seen before, or Marlow had never seen before. But at the same time, I don't think it's a hidden statement about the true similarities between two different groups of people. The story clearly sets borders of the us and the them, and those borders never really go away, even if they're blurred. By the end of it, there's no unified us, there's just the us that crosses over to the them. Sure, by the end, the concept is any of us could be any of them at a given moment. If we strip away our pretty rags, as Marlow said, there's never a real counterpoint that stops the distinction between the two. Now, I'm not saying all of this as if it's a bad thing, or the book is bad because of it. I'm not saying there needs to be a scene where Marlow befriends one of the Africans and he learns perfect English and Marlow's like, oh, I guess we're not so different after all. Or a scene where on his deathbed, Kurtz recognizes the error of his ways and says that these people he's raged against are no different from him. I think that would be disingenuous of Conrad's experience in the Congo and defeat a lot of the subtle themes that the narrative presents. I mostly say all of that because, as mentioned, a lot of people will tout this as some secret progressive victory for 1899, and I'm sure this message that the us can become them, that the heart of darkness is in every man, was powerful for the time. But I wouldn't agree with some and say that it's some secret message of racial equality. The story doesn't quite go that far. More so, I leave it up to you if you think this story is subversive or more in line with common thought of the time. Now, the theme of the story that is certainly called attention to and condemned, as mentioned earlier, is that of colonialism and imperialism. Marlow has all of these great ideas of what he'll do in Africa, of what the Europeans are doing in Africa. And while the company continues that mantra while he's there, he sees the reality of it. He sees that these are thieves and murderers, more explicit in the terms of the El Dorado expedition, but all of it is just piracy by another name, by some legal pretense, and how ultimately the company and Europe's efforts present an obscuring of morality to Marlow. Marlow never has a watershed moment in the story where he says that nothing good can be done, that they should not be here altogether. Instead, from his opening lines, Marlow seems to believe that there is some idea, some righteousness that separates them from the brutes. And while he never says that this idea is impossible, it is certainly impossible given the company's current condition. As mentioned earlier, the ivory trade's a pretty good metaphor. Something illustrious and exquisite that's wrought out of blood and violence. Even a lot of the company's actions seem nonsensical. There are several moments in the story where the work is just ridiculous. Them building a railroad by mindlessly blowing up pieces of rock. He walks across holes dug in the ground. He suspects that these are just made to be dug so the workers could have something to do. Even in smaller one-off instances, like the inability for rivets to show up to repair the steamboat. The pilgrims at the station using their rifles to shoot at a hippo, or on the boat using them to shoot into the jungle. Both cases do nothing. There's even a mention while the hut is on fire back at the central station that he's watching people carry pails of water to put out the fire, but there's holes in the bottom of the buckets. Not to mention that everyone within the company is constantly scheming. They all tout their ideas of effort, of work, of industrialization, but all anyone's there for is money. They want to get as much ivory as they can. They want to get promoted to where they can start making percentages of the ivory. And of course, nothing in the story reflects the madness of the company, of the madness of this whole scenario, of the violence and turmoil of it all, better than Kurtz. I believe Kurtz to be a personification of European imperialism in Africa. He was everything. He was something that was thought of so great that people could hardly describe it. To some, he was a masterful painter, painting a blind woman with a torch, a symbol of justice. Something that even in his final moments, Kurtz would remark to Marlow is important to him. To others, he was a politician, a musician, a lover. But if Kurtz had one trait, one that he never fell back on, and one that he is consistently good about throughout the story, it was that he was honest. Kurtz was cut from the same cloth Marlow was. He was sent by the same people. And when he got there and saw what the company was doing, he became that. A warlord who kills those who rebel against him. As Marlow mentions, this is no different than the enemies the French were firing at from the coast, or the criminals that were being led by chains. Kurtz boils it down to what they really are to the Europeans, rebels against an idea. He has these bizarre rituals where the other tribe leaders come and offer him offerings and sacrifices, much like the company did to the Africans of the Congo, and if they didn't fall in line, well, they were prisoners with the rest of the criminals, or rebels. He raided the land, killed elephants, and pillaged for his own wealth, only without some cloak of prosperity on the locals' behalf as the company touts. Marlow mentions that once you're out there by yourself, truth begins to become evident, truth without the cloak of time. And it seems, if anything, Kurtz was out there long enough to realize what he was. This is best seen by the 17-page report he wrote on savagery. Initially, all these eloquent ideas of how we must seem as gods to them, we must help them in our divine benevolence, only to end his writing by just saying, exterminate all the brutes. Because yeah, that's the end goal of this whole thing, right? We'll show up, we'll take what we want, and if we can't get what we want, well, then they're rebels. Pushing back against a greater idea, as Marlow's aunt said, against a divine work. It's this honesty that in the end makes Marlow side with Kurtz despite everything he knows about him over the company. And that's why the company is so fearful of Kurtz. If Kurtz had truly gone AWOL, he was just a worker that went into the jungle and gone mad. He could be written off, he could be killed, he could be captured, it wouldn't matter. But Kurtz is doing exactly what the company told him to, and he's getting more ivory than anyone else. If anything, he's honest about his condition and what the company is doing in Africa. Because of that, he has to go because he's all of the greed without the facade. It's the emperor not wearing any clothes and not trying to convince people that he is. So ultimately, what does Kurtz's final moments mean? When he's laying on the couch and says, the horror, the horror. Personally, I feel that this is Kurtz witnessing the atrocities he had done at the end, because I believe that's consistent with the theme of Kurtz embodying truth, the truth of what Europe is doing here. Marlow says that Kurtz had just mentioned he was waiting for death in the dark, and his eyes were open as if he was taking in all of creation, all of existence in his final moments. And it seems here, stripped of his ideas and his goals, he sees a clarity at what he's done, and the only thing he can remark is the horror of it. To me, this is the most profound message that Joseph Conrad gives through the book. Again, this was published at the height of European colonization. The Congo Free State was still happening at that time. So if Kurtz is a manifestation of all the things Europe and Belgium and every other country had done in Africa, then to have him in his final moments stripped of aspirations of glory, of ideas of purpose, and instead to have him remark on his life efforts as horrible is quite damning. It's as if to say there's a monster we are building that one day we will have to confront. And at this point, what will we have to say than to remark at the horror of it all? I mean, even down to the personification of Kurtz, you can see the symbolism. He's hailed as this grand idea, this masterful man, but by the time Marlow meets him, he's sick and dying on a stretcher. You can see the voice, the bravado of where something righteous once was, but it's just skin and bones now. He mentions twice that Kurtz lacks restraint. That's his greatest issue. Something indicative of the mass murder of elephants, people, and the land at the time. There's this moment earlier on in the book when Marlow hears that Kurtz sent the harlequin, or who we know eventually to be the harlequin, down with all the ivory as he's decided to go back to his station. And Marlow describes this scene of Kurtz turning around as 4 savages and a white man, not knowing yet that that white man was the most brutal of them all, the most brutal he would find on the continent. So if that's the case, what does it mean in the end that Marlow chose to lie on his behalf? Something that Marlow recounts multiple times he detests. He talks about the only goodness in Kurtz is that he was truth, and here at the end he rejects truth. I think it's because in the end, ultimately, Marlow doesn't see the full picture. To himself, he almost justifies this lie in order to keep the status quo, or in order to keep those around him happy, or to give them the memory of Kurtz. It's similar to the ideas he mentions about women a couple of times in the story, saying that they need to be preserved, their perfect view of the world can't be shattered. They don't know things, and as men, it's our job to not tell them things that would hurt them. This infantilization is comforting to Marlow because it allows him to, for one, justify the lie he told to the fiancé, but also to remove his accountability from the story. Because despite what Kurtz turned out to be, regardless, Marlow liked Kurtz. He liked the idea of Kurtz. He liked this visage, this idea of a powerful man. He was excited to meet him, but was disappointed when he turned out to be a bag of bones. But nevertheless, the idea of Kurtz meant something to him. It's as if in the end, this comforting lie, be it the lie of Kurtz or the lie of empires or countries or objectives, the lie was better than the truth because the truth was too dark, too honest. Earlier in the book, when Marlow kind of jumps ahead of the story and begins to describe this document that Kurtz had written that said exterminate all the brutes, Marlow begins to dwell on the idea of preserving Kurtz's memory and says this: I had full information about all these things, and besides, as it turned out, I was to have the care of his memory. I've done enough for it to give me the indisputable right to lay it, if I choose, for an everlasting rest in the dustbin of progress, amongst all the sweepings and, figuratively speaking, all the dead cats of civilization. But then, you see, I can't choose. He won't be forgotten. Whatever he was not common. He had the power to charm or frighten rudimentary souls into an aggravated witch dance in his honor. He could also fill the small souls of the pilgrims with bitter misgivings. He had one devoted friend at least, and he had conquered one soul in the world that was neither rudimentary nor tainted with self-seeking. No, I can't forget him, though I am not prepared to affirm the fellow was exactly worth the life we lost in getting to him. It's as if to Marlow, Kurtz has to mean something. He was too much to not mean anything. And in the end, despite the moral statutes he had built up of himself throughout the story, in the end, Marlow chooses to lie to keep the legend of Kurtz alive. Perhaps because it's easier on the fiancé, or perhaps it's easier on Marlow. The mind of man is capable of anything, be it a ferocious truth or a comforting lie. Something echoed through history time and time again and mirrored in the pages of Heart of Darkness. Heart of Darkness is such a powerful novel, and there's really not a lot like it. There's so many different ways you can view and interpret the story. There's a lot of people who lean on the mention Marlow had, that perhaps Kurtz had made some kind of deal with the devil, or the devil's out here. And devilish imagery pops up throughout the book. The mention of the papier-mâché Mephistopheles, the devilish beard of the agent, the sealed smile of the general manager. There's so many different ways to look at this story, and I certainly think it's one looking into. I highly recommend you check it out for yourself if this whole video hasn't been proof of that. So I'll have a print of it linked in the description if you want to check it out for yourself. Now, when books are as famous as Heart of Darkness, they're likely to lead to some adaptations. And Heart of Darkness has been adapted into dozens of stories. Some are straight up film adaptations of the book, but others have a more creative twist to it. Some video games, like Far Cry 2, fall back heavily on the plot of Heart of Darkness. As a matter of fact, the last level of that game is called Heart of Darkness, where you're on a riverboat. And Spec Ops: The Line, a game that touches on a ton of different themes from war to military to sacrifice, draws heavily on Mr. Kurtz for the game's antagonist, Colonel Conrad. But what I think is most interesting is when people take the core plot of Heart of Darkness and transport it into other times or places. Since a lot of the themes of the original novel are very dependent on the time and place that it's set in, you can move the plot to new regions and tell whole new stories. For example, there's a 1994 French-Canadian film called Wendigo, which, yes, a Heart of Darkness adaptation called Wendigo. I'm already sold. That film is about a group of Native Americans who take territory in northern Quebec, and it follows a reporter who's traveling up the Wendigo River to try to make contact with them. But I think the most impressive adaptation of Heart of Darkness, that is also, in my opinion, maybe the best film adaptation of a book of all time, is Apocalypse Now. And let me clarify that statement. I know that there are a ton of incredible films that are adapted from novels. The Godfather, Silence of the Lambs, Dune are all things taken from books. But I think Apocalypse Now may be the best adaptation in the sense that it adapts the source material in the most effective way. See, things I mentioned like The Godfather, Silence of the Lambs, pretty much take the book story and they make it to the big screen. But Apocalypse Now takes the book's themes and changes them in just the right ways to build a whole new story that is still true to the original. And it does this by taking the plot of the book and setting it in the Vietnam War. Instead of the company going to find a Mr. Kurtz who has gone AWOL from the company, in Apocalypse Now, it's the military going after Colonel Kurtz, who's gone AWOL from the military. Captain Benjamin Willard, played by Martin Sheen, is the story stand-in for Marlow, as he's an operative being sent into Vietnam and Cambodia to eliminate Colonel Kurtz. And he does this instead of traveling on a steamboat by traveling on a U.S. Navy patrol boat. And it adapts so many of the themes from the original story. In the book, Marlow mentions again and again how Kurtz was just a voice to him, an idea. And through the movie, we see or hear a visualization of that, as Captain Willard has several audio recordings of Kurtz that he listens to on the voyage, making Kurtz quite literally a voice in his head. Instead of stations the group comes across while they go up the river, they instead come across military bases, all falling in unique pits of insanity and depravity. If you watch the movie after knowing the plot of the book, the similarities are so on the nose. They meet a colonel at the first base they go to called Colonel Kilgore, someone who loves the war and seems to bask in the carnage of it. If you read the book, this is pretty clearly a stand-in for the general manager. But the movie has made the story so much its own that none of the elements seem out of place, and every character has their own unique identity to their book counterpart. I also think it's interesting because for most of us, it makes the theme of the story something more tangible. Most of us don't have first-hand experience with colonialism in action, perhaps the ramifications of it, but not a lot of us know people that are like still conquering lands and islands and countries, I think. But something we're all probably familiar with is war. The devastation it can have on a local populace, the feudalism of wars against people without uniform. And Apocalypse Now takes Heart of Darkness and changes it into this new tone that I think will probably connect with a lot of people in the modern age more than the book does. It's not to say it's better than the book or the book's bad by any means, just the themes of the film are probably more relevant. It's a fantastic movie that I highly recommend. Especially if you know the book, it's cool to watch it and notice all the similarities between the two. Like, for example, when they finally get to Colonel Kurtz's location, instead of a harlequin who's devoted himself to Kurtz, it's a war photographer. Just as eccentric, but covered in different cameras and film instead of a patchwork costume. Again, saying the same thing, but saying it in a way that makes sense to the setting. And the film itself is legendary in film history for so many reasons. It's directed by Francis Ford Coppola, the guy that made The Godfather. And there's so many stories of disastrous things happening on set. Marlon Brando's performance of Colonel Kurtz that has a legendary on-screen presence but had a ton of problems behind the scenes. There's a ton of different cuts of the movie, a theatrical cut, a redux, a director's cut. It's famous for a lot of reasons, and normally I would just recommend you go check it out. But now, I can do something even better. A while back, I was approached by Lionsgate, who wanted to start doing collaborations between Lionsgate and YouTubers. And yes, that's right, Lionsgate, the big movie company. For those that are familiar with the woes of the YouTube copyright system, it seems that Lionsgate is trying to establish connection with YouTubers so it's not as tedious to review their films, and, they're not being violently objecting of the digital age, as most movie companies tend to be. Well, in our conversations, I said that I was planning to make a video on Heart of Darkness, and of course, Apocalypse Now is a really cool adaptation of it. So while I was asking if I could get the rights to use clips of the film for this video, they said, why not just post the whole movie? So, I can't believe I'm saying this, in a few days, the entirety of Francis Ford Coppola's Heart of Darkness will be on the Wendigang channel. The whole film will premiere here, we can watch it together, and then it will remain on the channel for at least 6 months. After which point, we'll negotiate deals and contracts, but for the time being, they are splitting the revenue with me. I can't properly phrase to you how crazy that is. I'm used to movie companies shutting down entire videos for 3-second clips. And now a company is approaching YouTubers and saying, hey, you like these movies? Let's do something about it. I think it's really cool, and hopefully it leads to more of this, and more so, a better relationship between movie companies and YouTubers and the digital market. For so long, copyright laws in the entertainment industry have viewed people posting even clips or talking about films online as predatory. So hopefully this proves to be a step in the right direction for everyone, and I'm thankful to be a part of that step. I'm also a huge advocate for physical media. I like collecting DVDs and VHS tapes, so I'll also have a link in the description to Lionsgate's website, where you can purchase the digital edition or the 40th anniversary 6-disc edition of the film. Now, big underline to everything, if you purchase it or if you watch it on my channel, it is an R-rated movie for a reason. There's a ton of violence and swearing and slurs and everything else you would probably hear in Vietnam during the war. So viewer discretion advised, and please watch only if you're of age. I don't need Lionsgate coming to me and being like, hey, the deal went cool, but we're getting a lot of emails from angry moms who said they're like 9-year-old watch the film. And all I'll be able to say is, well, I told them not to do that. And also they sat through a very long video about Heart of Darkness, so maybe we cut them some slack. So look out for that while you can. Be sure to get in on the Redacted collection if you're interested, and above all else, thank you for watching. This is a book that I was more familiar with the influences of it than the story itself. And as soon as I read the story, I knew I wanted to talk about it. I think Kurtz is such a fascinating character. He's so many things at once. It's not so much that he himself is complex as much as Marlow's framing around him is complex. I think it's an interesting narrative and one that I want to see talked about more. So hopefully it's one that you enjoyed. Thank you for sticking around as long as you have, and Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. The support from you all has really meant the world, and 2025 has been a blessing through and through. I can't wait to see where we go in the new year. So be sure to check out those links in the description and stay tuned for the film. And I believe that should do it for now, but before I go, I just want to say thank you for watching. I hope that you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye! There's also another adaptation of this story that Marlow's just a crazy old man on a boat that made all of this up and just traumatized everyone listening for no reason. That's a funnier interpretation. I like that.